Robert Baratheon had always been a man of grand appetites. Wine, women, food, and war. He was a force of nature, or so the realm whispered, a bellowing king who fought with the strength of 10 lesser men. Yet, as the gods would have it, the truth that tumbled forth in King's Landing's halls possessed far more power than any cloud of his warhammer. On a sweltering afternoon, the sun staining the Red Keep's stones a pale gold, Robert took the Iron Throne with a thunderous expression. Guards lined the edges of the great hall, steel reflecting shards of light, and courtiers stood stiff as statues while the king's voice boomed across the cavernous chamber. He had summoned all to hear him, the lords of the realm, the ladies, the small folk of significance that might carry rumors out to the corners of Westeros. He had summoned them to deliver a stunning blow to the well-constructed illusions spun around his own family. Robert had never been one for subtlety. He was a man who knew how to smash, and smash he would, even if what he crushed was the perceived legitimacy of the children who bore his name. Word had come to him through Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell, who uncovered the darkest truth. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were not his children but were spawned from the twisted union of Cersei Lannister and her twin brother, Jaime. At first, the revelation left Robert stricken, a silent giant trembling with betrayal and heartbreak he would not show to any living soul. But soon enough that heartbreak had turned to rage, and that rage had led him here to this moment, to this hour where he would speak the truth to the 7 kingdoms. His voice roared through the great hall, calling out the deception. He did not hide the nature of Jaime and Cersei's affair, nor did he mask the serpentine web of lies in which the Lannisters had entangled the Iron Throne. He spilled every vile secret he had been told, brandishing it before the assembly as though it were another battered body at the Trident. People gasped, murmured. Some even wept at the downfall of the Queen's honor, but Robert had no tears to spare. As far as he was concerned, that lion's den was not his concern anymore. The stony face of Eddard Stark watched from the side, shoulders tense. He alone knew the king's plan for what came next, and he waited with dread, certain that a storm was about to break. Beyond the front ranks of knights and lords, Cersei Lannister stood, arms crossed, face drained of color. Her blonde hair, rich as gold, framed a visage set in cold fury. She tried, at times, to speak, to protest, but Robert's voice overrode all attempts, unstoppable as a raging boar. And then the final blow came. Joffrey Waters, as Robert now deemed him, was to be disinherited, officially stripped of any claim to the Iron Throne. Neither Myrcella nor Tommen had any part in the Baratheon line. Gendry, an acknowledged bastard the king had only recently discovered, would be named heir to the Iron Throne in their stead. The entire hall was awash in shock, confusion, and outrage, yet Robert did not care. He wanted the truth laid bare. To keep Joffrey in line was an insult to justice, to the old gods and the new, and to his own battered honor. Gendry had not been present for the announcement. The lad was still apprenticed to the armorer in the city, wholly ignorant of the king's intentions that day. He knew he was some bastard of the king's. He had guessed as much when he was old enough to see how the royal house colors matched his own black hair and the blue eyes that were so reminiscent of House Baratheon. Yet never had he dreamt that one day he might be called into the Red Keep with throngs of lords and ladies gawking at him like some curiosity. Nor did he imagine he would ever be seen as anyone beyond that bastard apprentice with a strong arm. But King Robert, with a bellowing command, soon had the gold cloaks fetch Gendry. They dragged him, begrimed in soot and sweat from working the forge, into the king's presence. The entire court stared, some in horror, some in amusement, some in fascination, at the soot-faced boy who possessed the same thick black hair as Robert had in his youth and the same broad shoulders. Gendry's eyes flickered with bewilderment. He tried to bow but did so clumsily, nearly stumbling as he recognized the lord who had once come to see him, Eddard Stark, standing near the dais. The hush that fell over the room was stifling. Cersei seethed at one side, knuckles white with tension. Jaime was not visible. Some said he was in the Kingsguard antechambers, confronted by his own share of condemnation from other white-cloaked knights. Tywin Lannister was absent, still in the field at Harrenhal or beyond. But none doubted that when word reached him, there would be war in his heart. King Robert stood, dragging himself from the Iron Throne with a slow, unsteady movement that belied too many hours drinking and too many old battle wounds. His gaze fell upon Gendry. No fatherly affection shone in his eyes, for the boy was just another symbol of a life Robert had spent in drunken neglect. Yet, beneath that weathered exterior, there was some faint spark of recognition, a sense of pride in the lad's sturdy build and quiet defiance. In a hoarse voice, Robert declared that Gendry, son of King Robert Baratheon, was no longer a nameless bastard. He would now be Gendry Baratheon, recognized and legitimized by royal decree, rightful heir to the Iron Throne until Robert sired another child through more legitimate means, or until the day Gendry might assume the crown in truth. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some older lords exchanged uneasy glances, for a legitimized bastard was no trifling matter. Royal bastards were often recognized in name, but seldom elevated so drastically, especially when there might yet be other ways to secure the throne. Joffrey, standing near his mother with fists clenched, looked ready to spit venom. He had never liked Gendry, never liked the gossip of the king's bastards who might one day overshadow him. Now, watching everything he was raised to believe was his taken away in a single utterance, Joffrey's face turned crimson. Yet he was still too stunned, too incredulous, to do more than stare. Myrcella and Tommen were nowhere to be seen. They had been whisked away from prying eyes, perhaps for their own safety. When Robert demanded that Gendry kneel, the boy did so slowly, uncertain, and the king laid a heavy hand on his head, proclaiming him Gendry Baratheon of the House Baratheon. There was no grandeur or pomp beyond that. No festival, no joyous feast. It was a grim ceremony bereft of hope, overshadowed by betrayal and fury. The hush remained unbroken until Robert, with a gesture, commanded the lords to depart. The spectators filed out. Cersei lingered, cold fury etched into every line of her face, but she held her tongue. For all her cunning, she knew Robert was a beast roused, and a cornered beast must not be provoked lest it lash out with mortal consequences. Gendry was ushered away by the master of arms. Confusion whirled inside him, but he was too proud to ask questions in that moment, among so many onlookers. The Red Keep was a labyrinth of stone corridors, flickering torchlight, and wary glances from passing servants. One room after another they passed until he was finally brought to new chambers, far more lavish than anything he had ever known. The bed was draped in furs. A polished table and ornate chairs sat by the hearth. There were even embroidered banners of House Baratheon, black-crowned stag on a field of gold, already hanging on the walls as if awaiting him. He felt as if he had stepped into another man's life. Within the hour, Eddard Stark came to visit. He asked after Gendry's well-being with the gentle solemnity of a man who understood the turbulence of fatherless children. Gendry answered politely, as best he could, and Stark told him how this development came about. Robert had discovered the incest. The rightful heir was no Lannister spawn but a Baratheon, and though Stannis and Renly might have been next in line by conventional laws of succession, Robert had made it plain that he would give the throne to his own flesh and blood first. Eddard explained that many lords would find this scandalous, that many might challenge it, but Robert's fury was unstoppable for now. He had pinned the realm's future on Gendry's shoulders. Gendry did not know how to feel. He was proud, in a way, to be recognized, but also numb with shock. He had never once thought of becoming a lord, let alone a king. The tasks of forging swords, hammering metal, and shaping steel were all he had ever known. Even in his wildest daydreams, perhaps he might have wondered who his father was or if he could someday earn the coin to open his own smithy. But the Iron Throne? It was unfathomable. Yet the weight pressed upon him now, though the crown was not yet on his brow. He could feel its presence looming in every corner of his new life. Far below, in the depths of the dungeons, Jaime Lannister was placed under guard. The news of his affair with Cersei, shouted openly by Robert, had undermined his status as a Kingsguard. Kevan Lannister was in the city, quietly rallying what allies remained, but without Tywin's presence, All was chaos among the lions. The gold cloaks eyed Jaime with mixed pity and scorn. The man known as the Kingslayer now faced an imprisonment that might end in his death if Robert decided to push the matter. But Robert had not yet decided Jaime's fate, nor Cersei's. For the moment, he let them stew, perhaps to see if Tywin would negotiate or attempt to break them out by force. Some whispered that Robert was punishing Jaime not only for the incest but also for the murder of the Mad King, Aerys Targaryen, though Robert had once pardoned him for that. The king's anger, all-consuming, had no neat boundaries. In the days that followed, the Red Keep was awash in speculation. Lords from the Reach, the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Stormlands convened in small gatherings to gossip about this new heir. Some were outraged that Robert would skip over his brothers, Stannis and Renly, to name a bastard as heir. Others wondered if Gendry would prove a malleable puppet or if the boy had inherited Robert's willful nature. Few had had much interaction with him beyond passing glimpses at the forge. Thus, Gendry soon found himself beset by visitors. A swirl of proud, cunning, or outright sycophantic nobles jostled for his attention, offering to teach him reading, dancing, or swordplay. They promised alliances, or subtly reminded him of the old ties their families once had to House Baratheon. They sought to cultivate his favor, or at least measure him as a future king. Gendry was overwhelmed, and he took to avoiding the court when possible, preferring to lurk in quieter corridors with Arya Stark, who had grown curious about this new boy who shared her father's sense of honesty. Eddard Stark, newly installed as Hand of the King, again this time firmly so, attempted to guide Gendry in the basics of nobility. The boy was taught how to address lords and ladies, how to hold a goblet of wine without gulping it down, how to sit in a throne room without appearing either too proud or too servile. It was an endless list of do's and don'ts that made Gendry's head spin. Sometimes, in the evenings, he snuck out to find the royal smithy. He had no real duty there, no right to be laboring away at the forge, but the clang of steel and the scent of burning coal was comforting, far more so than the hush of velvet-draped corridors. On one of those occasions, he found Arya Stark watching from the shadows. She teased him, said he looked more at home with a hammer than a crown, and he grinned back, grateful for her frankness. Within the city, the news spread. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were all bastards. The small folk, for the most part, accepted it. They had always whispered the children looked more like Lannisters than Baratheons anyway. All golden hair and green eyes. Now they had a new story to pass among themselves. They marveled at the turn of fate that had raised a bastard from a flea-bottom mother to the status of a prince. Some cheered it. After all, it was a kind of justice to see a common-born boy elevated. Others worried that it foreshadowed unrest, for no one could recall a king's bastard becoming heir without massive conflict. The gold cloaks patrolled the streets, watchful of potential riots, but for a time, the city remained in a simmering hush, waiting to see how the great houses would react. Tywin Lannister, upon hearing the news, did not fly into a blind rage as others might have predicted. Instead, he sent a terse missive to the king, demanding the release of Jaime and the immediate cessation of slander against Cersei. Robert snorted when he read it, calling it a father's delusions. He had no intention of pardoning Jaime, at least not yet. Robert thirsted for Tywin's reaction. He wanted the old lion to come forth to attempt to strike. The thought of waging war again, of smashing Lannisters as he had once smashed Rhaegar Targaryen, stirred a volatile excitement in him. He was an aging warrior who had never fully adapted to peacetime, and a new conflict might invigorate him as nothing else could. But the Iron Throne itself was uneasy. The Watchers in the Red Keep could sense that naming Gendry as heir might unify some lords behind the newly minted prince, but it would alienate others who saw it as a dangerous precedent. Stannis, at Dragonstone, sent a formal protest, stating that by all the laws of the realm, the throne should pass to the king's lawful brothers before any bastard, even a legitimized one, if Robert had no trueborn children. Renly, at Highgarden, seemed to have a more relaxed attitude. He was known to be charming, and he wrote a letter to Robert, half in jest, saying he would come to court to meet this new nephew soon enough, but that he had doubts about skipping over older, more experienced family members. Robert, in typical blustering fashion, replied that he was king and would name whom he damned well pleased. And so the seeds of another succession crisis were sown. In the midst of this upheaval, Gendry was forced to adopt a new life. He dressed in nicer clothes now, still practical but made of finer fabrics. A black doublet embroidered with gold thread, breeches that didn't stink of coal, boots with polished buckles. He was given tutors, a maester to teach him reading and writing, a knight to train him in the art of swordsmanship, and a courtier to refine his manners. Gendry chafed under all of it, though he understood in some corner of his mind that a king must learn these things. Still, he often wore a scowl, feeling trapped. On one especially difficult day, he managed to slip away down to the shipyard, hoping to see the waters of Blackwater Bay and clear his head. He wandered for a bit along the quays, ignoring stares from those who recognized him. Then he ducked into an old boathouse, deserted except for a stray cat prowling in the shadows. To his surprise, he found Arya Stark there, practicing small jabs with a wooden sword. She whipped around when she heard his footsteps and threatened to crack him across the skull. He held up his hands in mock surrender. They exchanged a few words, mostly teasing remarks. He admitted he hated the stuffy rooms of the Red Keep, that he missed the clang of the smithy. Arya, who often felt stifled by her lessons in sewing and courtiership, empathized. They sat for a moment discussing swords, forging, and the differences between the tasks they were expected to do and the tasks they longed to do. Over time, Arya became Gendry's closest friend in the keep. Sansa Stark was too enamored of the idea of being queen once, or at least had been, to easily relinquish the notion that Joffrey might have been a fair prince in her illusions. Now her illusions were shattered, and she was left confused, mourning the dream more than the actual boy. She did not quite know what to make of Gendry and so avoided him. But Arya saw him for the lad he was, someone who had been thrust into a role he never sought. Eddard Stark's presence as Hand provided some measure of stability. Ned insisted on daily lessons in statecraft for Gendry. He taught him that if a king did not learn the ways of the lords and the needs of the small folk, the realm would suffer. Gendry listened, though half his mind was always on the next chance to slip away. Still, the boy learned quickly. His mind was sharper than one might expect, for smithing demanded precision and memory as well as strength, and Gendry was not lacking in intelligence. With time, he at least came to understand the basics of heraldry, the relationships between houses, and the nature of bannermen in the Stormlands. That was the region he would someday rule with personal authority if Robert ever passed, and Gendry realized it might not be so bad to be the heir, if it meant having a domain where he could, in theory, protect people and maintain order. Robert himself did not spend much time teaching Gendry. He was often off hunting, drinking, or raging about in the throne room. Sometimes he would summon Gendry, half-drunk, and attempt to pass on fatherly wisdom about how to smash your foes or bed a wench. Gendry found these lessons awkward and unhelpful. But he did glean something of warfare from Robert's stories about the rebellion against Aerys Targaryen. He learned how Robert had rallied the Stormlands, how he had defeated Rhaegar at the Trident. Gendry understood that, while his father might be a brash man, he possessed the heart of a warrior king. And so Gendry tried to absorb some knowledge of martial leadership from him, even if it was couched in drunken boasting. Tensions in the capital steadily grew. Joffrey and Cersei remained within the Red Keep, but each day their status seemed more tenuous. Joffrey's behavior grew erratic. He would lash out at servants, bark orders that guards ignored. The gold cloaks no longer deferred to him. He was, in their eyes, no longer the prince, no longer the heir. Cersei, still forcibly remaining as queen until Robert decided her fate, walked the corridors with her head held high, ignoring whispers and outright sneers from those who despised the Lannisters. She spent her days scheming, sending letters to allies, perhaps planning an escape or some other desperate measure. But Robert watched her with suspicious eyes, and so did Ned Stark, who kept close watch on the Queen's door with the help of trusted men. In the corridors, Gendry bumped into Joffrey once. The confrontation crackled with tension. Joffrey sneered, calling him a filthy bastard, spitting on the ground near his feet. Gendry tried to remain calm, remembering Ned's lessons. But Joffrey's words cut at his pride. He retorted that at least he had the Baratheon look. Joffrey, face reddening, reached for a dagger at his belt. The two boys stood, adrenaline surging, until a Kingsguard knight, Ser Meryn Trant, strode around the corner, glaring. By all rights, Trant should have recognized Gendry as the prince, but his loyalties were uncertain, clouded by years in the Lannisters' favor. However, he did not dare let the boys fight in the corridor. He commanded them both to part ways. Joffrey stalked off in a rage. Gendry felt the tremble in his own hand, his breath quick. It was the first time he realized that, recognized or not, the Lannisters would see him as an enemy, and a vulnerable one at that. Elsewhere, talk of the upcoming small council sessions filled the keep. Ned Stark insisted Gendry should attend a few to learn the responsibilities of governance. So one morning, Gendry found himself in the council chamber, a high-ceilinged room with a massive table shaped like a map of Westeros, though old and chipped. Varys, the master of whisperers, sat with spider-like poise, smiling enigmatically. Peter Baelish, master of coin, lounged in his seat, eyes sharp as he studied the new heir. Grand Maester Pycelle dozed in his chair, occasionally chiming in with platitudes. Renly Baratheon had finally arrived from Highgarden and took his seat at the table, outwardly pleasant toward Gendry yet with a tinge of coolness in his eyes. Stannis was absent, his seat vacant, a silent reminder of the rift that the king's decision had caused. Robert presided over the meeting, though with less patience than Ned Stark might have wished. The issues at hand were numerous. Tywin Lannister's threatened response, the situation with Jaime's imprisonment, the realm's finances, which were in dire straits, and the ravens coming from the north about potential troubles beyond the wall. Gendry sat, mostly silent, absorbing the swirl of discussion. He listened to Renly's carefully worded questions about the line of succession. He heard Ned Stark pushing for a diplomatic approach to resolve tensions with the Lannisters, but Robert scoffed at the notion. Varys offered subtle warnings about Tywin's capacity for vengeance. Littlefinger joked that gold wins more wars than swords, drawing a frown from Renly. Even in that first council session, Gendry felt how labyrinthine politics could be. Every word had a nuance. Every statement was loaded with hidden meaning. The courtiers tested each other constantly. At one point, Robert turned to Gendry and demanded his opinion on how to deal with the Lannisters. Gendry, startled, stammered. He recalled how Ned Stark had taught him that a show of strength could sometimes deter a battle. So Gendry said something about maybe fortifying certain strategic points near the Crownlands, ensuring that if Tywin marched an army, he would face immediate resistance. Robert actually smiled at that, praising Gendry for having a mind for war. Littlefinger quipped that war was an expensive pastime, and Gendry, still uncertain, mumbled that he did not mean to rush to war but to prevent it. Ned gave him a small nod of approval. Cersei, though not a small council member, was rumored to hold her own secret councils. Servants whispered of hush-hush meetings with Kevan Lannister and other loyalists. Tywin had commanded them to remain calm, to wait, to see if the king would relent or if there was an opening for diplomacy. But time passed, and Robert's anger remained. Jaime languished in captivity, though he was given comfortable quarters in the dungeons. Rumors of Tywin raising troops in the west were confirmed by multiple Raven reports. A line of conflict was being drawn, reminiscent of the days leading to the War of the Five Kings. Yet the realm was not entirely sure if it would truly come to war, or if Robert would broker some agreement to keep the peace. All the while, Gendry's own training continued. Eddard Stark took him to the courtyard, presenting him with a sword, the first blade of high-quality Gendry had ever owned. It was not Valyrian steel, but it was hammered by an accomplished smith, with a sturdy hilt wrapped in black leather. The crossguard bore a gold inlay of the stag's head. Gendry accepted it with gratitude. He had wielded a hammer for forging, but a sword was a different beast. Still, his strong arms gave him an advantage in sparring, and he learned the footwork with surprising agility, guided by Winterfell's master-at-arms, a man Ned had brought along. This training proved a point of curiosity among the castle's watchers. The new heir was a blacksmith's apprentice, so perhaps he would be unstoppable if given the right tutelage. Arya sparred with him sometimes in secret, though Ned insisted she learn from Syrio Farrell, the Braavosi water dancer he had procured as her dancing master. Gendry found Arya's style foreign and quick, reliant on speed and dexterity rather than raw power. Often she'd land a mocking tap on his thigh before he could swing fully. In return, he teased that she was too small to be a real fighter. She bristled, retorting that real fighters didn't rely just on brute force. The banter came easily, and for a short while each day, Gendry felt normal again, as if he were just a boy in King's Landing, not the heir apparent to the Iron Throne. But he could not escape his destiny indefinitely. Each day brought fresh reminders of the path he had been forced onto. The lords sought his favor. The small council demanded his presence. His father, Robert, loomed large in the background, sometimes ignoring him entirely, sometimes thrusting him into the spotlight with a command. Meanwhile, the realm braced for the Lannisters' response to their public humiliation. That response finally arrived in a pointed letter from Tywin Lannister. A demand for Jaime's release, for Cersei to be permitted to leave court freely, and for the king to renounce Gendry's claim under the threat of war. Robert read it aloud in the council chamber, voice rumbling with disdain. He tore the parchment in half and roared that the lions could come and try to take the throne if they dared. Ned Stark tried to counsel caution, but Robert overrode him. Varys tittered about the potential for chaos. Littlefinger smirked and inquired if the crown had enough coin to fund a new war. Renly eyed them with apprehension, stating that if it came to open conflict, the Reach might choose neutrality unless a marriage alliance was arranged. Ned rubbed his temples. Gendry, listening, felt a cold knot in his stomach. Everything was spiraling toward battle. Word reached Dragonstone. Stannis glowered in silent fury. He believed that he, as Robert's elder brother, was the rightful heir if the children were illegitimate. Stannis had always believed in the letter of the law. This new twist offended his every sense of justice. A bastard, no matter how royal, should not usurp him. But Stannis was also a man of unwavering loyalty to the realm, and he did not wish to plunge Westeros into another war. So he wrote a letter to Robert, urging him to reconsider. Robert refused to even read it at length, passing it off to Ned and muttering curses about Stannis' stiff neck. Ned sighed, for he had once hoped these two brothers might mend their differences. That hope was growing dimmer. In private, Gendry sometimes thought about giving it all up. He confided in Arya that maybe he didn't even want the throne, that perhaps he should run away, go back to being a smith. Arya, with a frown, told him that he was braver than that. She said, ironically, that if he wanted to run off, she'd go with him, but she doubted they'd get far without half the city noticing. They shared a small, humorless laugh at the idea. Then Arya grew serious. She reminded Gendry that despite everything, many small folk would rather see a king who understood them than another spoiled princeling. She had walked among common folk in the city markets, and she knew how they viewed lords. Gendry was one of them in many ways. Perhaps that was why Robert had chosen him. One early morning, Gendry was summoned to the Royal Solar where he found Robert alone. The king was holding a cup of ale, half-dressed in his undershirt, hair disheveled. He gestured for Gendry to sit. In that private setting, Robert seemed weighed down by something far heavier than the Iron Throne. He stared at his bastard son, the child he had never known, never cared for in the slightest, until politics forced them together. He admitted in a halting voice that he had not been a good father. Gendry said nothing, for there was no disputing that. Robert then muttered about the Targaryens, about how a mad king had forced him to spill blood and seize the throne, about how it was never supposed to be him, about how he was only a good warrior and never learned to be a good king. He said that the throne was a curse, that it would weigh upon Gendry's shoulders until the day he died. Gendry listened, half in awe, half in discomfort. He saw the cracks in the jovial, roaring facade of King Robert. He saw a broken man, tormented by regrets, by the ghosts of war. At one point, Robert looked away, clearing his throat. He advised Gendry to find someone he loved, to hold on to them, because the throne would steal away all joys otherwise. Gendry didn't know how to respond, but the sincerity of Robert's words lingered. Shortly after, the tension in King's Landing reached a flashpoint. A Lannister host was marching east. Reports said that Tywin himself led an army of 10,000 men, knights in gilded armor, heading toward the Blackwater. The king was left with two choices: treat or fight. Robert, never one to shy from battle, bellowed that he would meet Tywin in open war before surrendering Gendry's claim. Ned Stark tried one last time to bring sense into the matter, proposing that they at least negotiate. If Robert gave Jaime back, perhaps Tywin would retreat. But Robert was convinced that Tywin would never rest until Joffrey was restored or some arrangement beneficial to the Lannisters was forced upon them. Desperate to avoid bloodshed, Ned brokered a compromise. Jaime would be freed, on the condition that he take the Black and join the Night's Watch, thus removing him from the line of succession and effectively punishing him for his crimes without executing him. Joffrey and Myrcella would be allowed to keep the name Lannister, but not the name Baratheon, and Tommen would remain in King's Landing as a ward, though not as an heir. In exchange, Tywin would swear allegiance to Robert's recognized heir, Gendry, and recall his army. It was a bold plan, relying on Tywin's desire to preserve the rest of his family. Robert agreed, though half-heartedly, because Ned pointed out that war would tear the realm apart just as winter approached. A raven was dispatched to Tywin with the terms. The entire city waited on edge for his response. Some doubted the old lion would ever accept. Others believed Tywin might be shrewd enough to keep Jaime's head on his shoulders, especially if war was not guaranteed victory for the Lannisters. Even with their wealth, the Lannisters might have a tough fight against the combined forces of the Crown, the Reach, if Renly could be swayed, and other loyal bannermen. After a week of tense silence, Tywin's reply arrived. He would meet with Ned Stark, Robert, and Gendry at a parley field outside King's Landing. The realm collectively held its breath. On the appointed day, the outskirts of King's Landing saw two camps pitched opposite each other. Soldiers bristled with arms. The gold cloaks stood behind the king's banners, while Lannister men displayed crimson and gold. The day was gray, clouds gathering overhead, as if the gods themselves were uncertain of the outcome. Robert, clad in plate armor that groaned around his girth, rode out with Gendry at his side. Ned Stark, also armored, led a small retinue. From the other side, Tywin Lannister approached astride a magnificent warhorse, flanked by heavily armored knights bearing the Golden Lion. They dismounted in a small clearing. The air was thick with anticipation. Robert glared at Tywin, who returned the gaze impassively. Ned Stark cleared his throat and spoke the proposed terms again. Tywin remained stoic, his green eyes flicking to Gendry with the barest hint of contempt. At times, he asked questions. How would the realm treat Myrcella and Tommen? Ned calmly answered that they would be allowed to keep their courtesy titles but would not be recognized as royalty. Tywin asked about Joffrey's future. Robert growled that Joffrey would go to Casterly Rock if Tywin wanted him, but he would never hold a claim to the Iron Throne. At last, Tywin demanded that Jaime's sentence be rendered in writing, that he would join the Night's Watch, never to bear arms in the realm again except in its defense, never to inherit lands, never to marry. Robert looked to Gendry, who felt a strange sense of responsibility for the first time. By naming him heir, all of this chaos had erupted. He locked eyes with Tywin, taking in the older man's rigid, imposing demeanor. Gendry spoke, voice wavering a bit, but trying to project confidence. He said that if Tywin agreed to these terms, Jaime would be released that very day and escorted to the wall. Gendry's heart hammered, for he realized the power of a king, or a king's heir, when forging or breaking men's destinies. Tywin paused. A hush fell. The wind ruffled the standards on both sides. Finally, Tywin inclined his head, so minutely it could hardly be called a bow. He would accept, he said, if and only if Jaime was brought before him to hear it himself, and if Joffrey was allowed to ride back with him to Casterly Rock. He also insisted that the crown repay certain debts to House Lannister, though he left the sum ambiguous. Robert, scowling, nodded. It was done. Jaime was brought forth, shackled, guarded by a dozen gold cloaks. He wore a smirk, though there was tension in his eyes. He was made to kneel while Ned Stark read the vow. Jaime would travel north with an escort, presumably to be delivered to Castle Black. Tywin stood silent as his son was thus exiled. It was a harsh blow. Yet Tywin had chosen Jaime's life over a potential war that might have cost House Lannister everything. Once the vow was read, Jaime was led away. Joffrey, who stood with his mother at a short distance, glowered at Gendry. Then Joffrey mounted up, prepared to ride west with Tywin's host. He cast one last hateful glance at Gendry, bitterness in every sinew of his scowling face. Cersei lingered, forced by Robert's terms to remain in the capital until further arrangements were made for her. She did not look at Robert or Gendry as she drifted back toward her litter, ignoring everyone. When the parley concluded, the threat of open war receded, though mistrust still ran thick as blood. Tywin withdrew his army, and King's Landing let out a collective sigh of relief. Robert returned to the city in a better mood than he had been in weeks, crowing that the Lannisters had been forced to kneel. Ned Stark quietly warned that Tywin was not a man to forget humiliation, that one day he might seek revenge. Robert shrugged it off. All that mattered to him was that Gendry's claim remained uncontested for now. As the weeks passed, the tension settled into an uneasy peace. Jaime was indeed taken north, escorted by a retinue of Black brothers that Ned arranged. Joffrey resided at Casterly Rock with Kevin Lannister, effectively out of sight and out of mind for the time being. Cersei prowled the Red Keep, stripped of her queenly authority, though officially she was still Robert's wife until a divorce might be arranged, or until Robert chose another path. She rarely spoke, except to lash out at servants. But sometimes she would look at Gendry with a gaze of smoldering hatred. She blamed him for all her losses, never mind that her own incest had set everything in motion. Gendry, for his part, learned to avoid her presence. In the midst of all this, Gendry's daily life as heir continued, shaped by lessons, training, and a strange mixture of isolation and scrutiny. He had no real companions his own age aside from Arya, and occasionally Tommen, who was still a sweet boy unaware of most of the politics around him. Myrcella had departed to Dorne under a betrothal arrangement orchestrated by the Small Council, an attempt to strengthen ties with House Martell. Thus, the Red Keep was left with a pale imitation of normal family life. Robert, Gendry, occasionally Tommen playing in the courtyard, and Cersei brooding in her chambers, overshadowed by the knowledge that her father might still scheme for her release. Peace in Westeros never lasted long, and rumors of trouble in the north gradually reached the capital. Eddard Stark spoke of missing rangers beyond the wall, of talk about White Walkers, old wives' tales to most. Robert dismissed the stories as nonsense. Gendry found them unsettling, though he had no direct knowledge of the north. Still, Ned insisted that the realm should not be caught unawares. He talked to Gendry privately, explaining that a king must protect all corners of his domain, even from threats that sound like legends. Gendry promised that, if he ever wore the crown, he would remember the North's warning. It was enough to earn Ned's faint smile. Yet not all challenges to Gendry's new status had melted away. Whispers circulated that Stannis might openly declare himself the rightful heir. There were also rumors in the streets that another Targaryen might still live across the narrow sea. And, of course, the lingering possibility that Robert might sire a trueborn son or daughter if he remarried or if he and Cersei ever produced a legitimate child. An unlikely scenario, given what was now known. Each rumor fed the city's ceaseless appetite for intrigue, and Gendry was made aware that the road ahead was far from certain. Nevertheless, King Robert seemed content to let things lie as they were for a while, indulging in hunts and feasts when the mood struck him. The small council carried on the business of the realm, with Ned Stark often leaning on Gendry to observe. Gradually, Gendry gained some fluency in the governance that so bored the king. Littlefinger noted his growing competence and tried to charm him with illusions of financial cunning. Varys periodically congratulated him in a silken voice on becoming a man of the court. Renly teased him about the burdens of monarchy. Through it all, Gendry maintained a careful stoicism, never fully trusting any of them except perhaps Ned and Arya. Time wore on. One mild afternoon, Gendry stood at the window of his new solar, gazing out across the city of King's Landing. From that vantage point, the sprawl of rooftops, winding alleys, and battered walls seemed more majestic than squalid. Smoke curled from 1,000 chimneys. Distant horns announced a ship arriving in the harbor. He could see the fields beyond, and further still, the roads where travelers entered the city. He remembered that not too long ago, he might have been one of those travelers, an anonymous bastard, just another face in the crowd. Now he was in the Red Keep, draped in a black and gold cloak, recognized as the future king of the Seven Kingdoms. He felt conflicted, as always. Part of him missed the forge, missed the simplicity of honest labor. Another part of him, though, began to stir with a sense of responsibility. He had seen the way the small folk looked to the Red Keep for justice, for leadership, and so often they were met with corruption or indifference. Perhaps, he thought, if he learned enough, if he grew wise, he could change that if and when he wore the crown. The notion was daunting, but also strangely invigorating. Arya burst into his solar without knocking, brandishing a wooden practice sword. She insisted he come down to the courtyard, where Ned had arranged a new master-at-arms for them both, an expert knight from the Stormlands. Gendry laughed at her brash entrance, remarking that someday she might get him in trouble. But he followed, grateful to exchange the heavy thoughts of kingship for the clang of weapons. Down in the courtyard, under the watchful eye of the new instructor, they sparred. Gendry used his standard stance, heavy swings, while Arya darted around him like a water dancer. Eventually, the instructor told Arya she needed more discipline and told Gendry that his footwork was too slow. They exchanged sheepish grins, each aware of the other's flaws yet supportive in their own irreverent way. Later, as Gendry toweled sweat from his brow, Ned approached him with a kind expression. The Lord of Winterfell offered a few pointers on handling a blade, then gently steered the conversation toward the future. He told Gendry that, as time passed, the realm would look to him for leadership. He spoke of how a just ruler must listen to counsel but trust his own sense of right and wrong. Gendry, uncertain, asked if Ned believed he could truly be a good king. Ned paused. He admitted that the realm was full of would-be kings, some with less claim and others with more. Yet he believed that if Gendry truly cared about the people and was willing to work hard to learn the craft of ruling, he might be a better king than many who wore the crown before him. That simple statement of faith heartened Gendry more than any lavish praise ever could. Soon, a flurry of ravens brought news from across Westeros. The Vale remained quiet, pledged to the Iron Throne but watchful. The Riverlands, under Hoster Tully, were calm for now. The Westerlands had withdrawn to their own territory, licking their wounds. Dorne was welcoming Myrcella with polite formality, though the Martells had never forgiven the Lannisters for past wrongs. In the north, small cracks of tension were appearing along the wall, with the Night's Watch severely undermanned. And the Iron Islands were rumored to be stirring, the new Lord Balon Greyjoy looking for weakness in the realm's rulers. So the realm was not at peace, not truly. It was in a precarious balance, one that might topple at the slightest push. Robert showed little interest in confronting any of these problems himself. He delegated them to Ned Stark, who quietly shouldered the burden. Sometimes Ned would pull Gendry aside, explaining the intricacies of dealing with the Iron Islands or managing the crown's debts. On occasion, Gendry would overhear Robert ranting that a king should just smash his enemies and be done with it. But Ned remained steadfast, showing Gendry the value of diplomacy and alliances. In those lessons, the boy found the beginnings of leadership that might one day steer the Seven Kingdoms. Cersei watched it all with a stony mask. She had, in essence, lost her children to the realm's new order. Joffrey was in Casterly Rock, Myrcella in Dorne, and Tommen was overshadowed by Gendry at court. She had lost Jaime to the Night's Watch, likely never to return. Robert treated her with cold disregard. Sometimes, the courtiers whispered that she might poison Gendry or arrange an accident. But Ned Stark maintained a careful watch, ensuring that her movements were monitored, her letters intercepted when suspicious. Varys had his little birds singing constantly about the Queen's doings. So for now, she was trapped, a gilded prison but a prison nonetheless. As the months slipped by, Gendry gradually grew into his role. He did not revel in it, nor did he shrink from it as he once had. He spent time with the Stormland lords who came to pay homage. Lords Penrose, Tarth, Estermont, and others. He learned the names of their knights, the number of troops they could field, the nature of their alliances. Some of them praised him openly, calling him Prince Gendry, while others were more reserved, believing that Stannis or Renly might still claim the throne. But Gendry met them in earnest, forging connections. He had discovered that courtesy and sincerity went a long way, and he lacked the arrogance or cruelty of some princes they might have known. Meanwhile, Arya accompanied him when she could, bored by the talk of lords but intrigued by the glimpse it offered into the realm's politics. The two confided in each other about how strange life in King's Landing had become. Arya missed Winterfell, her family's pack of wolves, and the cold, crisp air of the north. Gendry missed the scorching heat of the forge, the simple certainty that when you struck a piece of iron, you shaped it into something stronger. Life at court was intangible, full of illusions, yet they made the best of it. One day, Robert summoned Gendry to the throne room, which was empty save for a handful of gold cloaks. Robert sat upon the iron throne, his broad form looking almost comical among the twisted swords. He beckoned his son forward. Gendry approached, bowing stiffly. Robert asked if Gendry loved the realm. Surprised by the question, Gendry replied that he was learning to. Robert nodded as if that was enough. He told Gendry that soon the realm would need a strong ruler. Robert had no illusions about his own health. His excesses had taken their toll. He confessed that he might not be long for the world, that one day soon, Gendry would be king. Gendry felt a chill. He had not realized how quickly fate might thrust the crown upon him. Robert waved him away, adding that he should be ready when the time came. It was as close to fatherly advice as Robert could give. From that day forward, Gendry poured even more effort into his lessons. He delved into the histories of great kings, from Jaehaerys Targaryen to Aegon the Conqueror to the more recent line of Targaryens, analyzing their methods, their successes, and their failings. He studied Robert's own war and how the alliances had formed. Ned Stark continued to guide him, along with a rotation of maesters. Now and then, Gendry returned to the forge in secret, forging small trinkets or practicing the craft he loved. He even made a gift for Arya, a small dagger with a wolf's head pommel, which she received with an almost boyish grin. Yet the looming specter of more conflict remained. The Lannisters nursed their grudges, Stannis his claim, and other lords wondered if they might exploit the uncertainty. Whispers of dragons across the sea floated about, but they were distant echoes, easily dismissed by the High Lords who believed that the Targaryens were finished. The north, though, was not so distant, and soon ravens brought more disturbing news about the rise of wildlings gathering under a king beyond the wall and sightings of walking corpses. Robert called the tales ridiculous, but Ned pressed for more men to be sent to the Night's Watch. Only after repeated urging from Ned, and a solemn second from Gendry, who argued for the Watcher's need, did Robert consent to send a modest contingent of troops. Perhaps it was the first time Robert recognized that Gendry might have a sense of duty to the realm. In truth, Robert just wanted to avoid hearing Ned's pleas again. As Gendry's status solidified, some of the tensions around him began to ease. Lords grudgingly accepted that Robert was set on this course. The city's small folk, who once might have doubted him, had begun to cheer for him if he rode past on his horse. They saw his strong arms, reminiscent of a working man, and it gave them a sense that one of their own might rule. In the taverns of Flea Bottom, they told tales of how Gendry used to apprentice to a local blacksmith, forging helmets and breastplates. They repeated the story of how he was discovered by Eddard Stark. Some even exaggerated that Gendry once killed a man with a single blow from his hammer, a rumor Gendry had no idea how to disprove. In the Red Keep, life took on a tenuous normalcy. Cersei was a prisoner in all but name, though she was still addressed as the Queen. Tommen followed Gendry around like a younger brother, full of wide-eyed innocence. Arya continued her training, sometimes clashing with Sansa, who was still mourning the loss of her romantic illusions. Ned Stark quietly managed the realm, dealing with daily crises, from trade disputes in the narrow sea to bandit raids in the riverlands. Robert drank, hunted, and occasionally tested Gendry with some rough fatherly advice. And Gendry himself spent his days absorbing knowledge and training, uncertain of when or how fate would thrust the crown upon him. He found a measure of contentment in small acts, visiting the courtyard stables to check on the horses, chatting with the servants who saw him as less intimidating than most royals, sneaking away with Arya to the waterfront to watch the ships. In those moments, the weight of the crown lifted briefly, and he felt like an ordinary boy. But always, the specter of the throne loomed, reminding him that every step he took was observed, every decision weighed. He was the heir after all, and one day, everything would rest upon his shoulders. That day came sooner than anticipated. Late one night, Robert returned from a boar hunt, gravely wounded by a tusk. He was carried into the Red Keep, blood pouring from his side, delirious from pain and drink. The maesters did what they could, but the wound was deep and foul. By morning, the king was pale and gasping. Eddard Stark stood at his bedside, sorrow etched into his face. Cersei hovered nearby, a tumult of emotions running beneath her mask of cold composure. Gendry was summoned, shaking, not yet ready to lose this gruff, distant father he'd only just begun to know. Robert beckoned him closer with a trembling hand. He told Gendry he had no regrets for disinheriting Joffrey, only regrets that he hadn't been a better king or a better man. Then he pressed a letter into Gendry's hands, his royal will, naming Gendry as his successor, with Ned Stark as regent until Gendry came of age. He made Ned promise to guide Gendry. Tears pricked at Ned's eyes, but he nodded solemnly. Robert's final words were a slurred mixture of curses against boars and a plea that Gendry take care of the realm. Then the king of the Seven Kingdoms closed his eyes for the last time. The breath left Robert's body, and with it, the old era passed. A hush settled over the Red Keep, broken by Cersei's low gasp. She retreated from the bedside, eyes flicking to Gendry with a swirl of hatred and fear. Ned placed a hand on Gendry's shoulder. In that instant, everything changed. Gendry felt the full weight of the crown slam onto his shoulders, heavier than any hammer he had ever lifted. He was not yet of age, technically, but by the king's will, he was now Gendry Baratheon, king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms, protector of the realm. The coronation took place in the Great September of Baelor a week later. It was a somber affair, overshadowed by Robert's funeral, but the realm demanded continuity. Ned Stark placed the crown on Gendry's dark curls. The High Septon anointed him with the 7 oils. Lords from every corner of the realm, some grudging, some curious, some supportive, were present to witness. The crowd outside the September was vast, craning to see this boy king. Gendry tried to stand tall, tried not to tremble. He glanced at Arya, who offered him a small grin. Then he took his oath, voice carrying in the vaulted space. He would protect the realm, uphold justice, and honor his father's name. And so a new king was made. As the days turned into weeks, the challenges came swiftly. Cersei attempted to rally Lannister sympathizers to her cause, but Tywin, writing from the Westerlands, recognized Gendry's rule, his previous agreement preventing immediate war. Stannis declared that he would abide by the king's will but wrote letters reminding everyone that Gendry was still a bastard by birth, legitimized or not. Renly was more cordial, offering to serve as a counselor to his nephew. Gendry accepted, though Ned remained his true regent and protector. The kingdom faced unrest in multiple regions, and the threat beyond the wall grew. Yet Gendry pressed on. He listened to Ned's counsel, formed a new small council with lords he trusted, and worked tirelessly to ensure the realm did not splinter. In the courtyard, where once Robert's boisterous laughter echoed, now Gendry's measured footsteps paced. He asked Ned to stay by his side as he navigated the labyrinth of kingship. Ned agreed, though he yearned for Winterfell, for the north that needed him. They agreed that once Gendry had a firm grip on the throne's reins, Ned could return home. Perhaps by then, Gendry would have the tools to rule alone. The boy king sought to reign with a sense of fairness. He pardoned minor Lannister loyalists who submitted, preferring to unite rather than sow more discord. He eased the burdens on the small folk in King's Landing by improving grain distribution, an initiative Ned had begun. He asked for advice from his council on how to manage the crown's debts, much to Littlefinger's amusement, but Gendry insisted he would not ignore the realm's finances. He had seen how a blacksmith's shop could fail if not handled properly. A kingdom was not so different in principle. In those early weeks, Gendry found solace in the simpler tasks of forging alliances, literally and figuratively. He had a new sword commissioned for himself, though he left much of the forging to the master smith. Still, he offered some input on the design, a black and gold hilt, with a stag carved into the pommel, reminiscent of his father's warhammer. He practiced daily with the weapon, determined not to be a king who couldn't wield a blade. Arya often sparred with him, gleefully reminding him that she was still faster. Little by little, the city and the realm grew accustomed to King Gendry. They saw a lad with broad shoulders and a humble manner. Some doubted him, some praised him. But each passing day he spent among the people, hearing their concerns, forging connections, showed that he was not some aloof puppet. He was raw, uncertain in the ways of cunning politics, but he had heart, and he had Ned Stark's guidance to temper him. Cersei remained a problem. She refused to bend the knee openly. She lingered in her quarters, plotting. But with Tywin's reluctant acceptance of the new king, her power was limited. She wrote letters filled with slander, calling Gendry an up-jumped bastard who had robbed her son. But those letters held little sway. As time wore on, she found herself increasingly isolated. Tommen, still in the keep, was cared for by servants loyal to the crown, and he seemed content enough in a child's carefree world. Cersei's bitterness festered, but it had no immediate outlet, and so she existed as a sullen figure, rarely seen at court. In the months following his coronation, Gendry's reign saw small steps toward stability. He was crowned under a cloud of scandal, but that same scandal, exposing Cersei and Jaime's incest, had prevented a larger war by dethroning Joffrey before he could fully seize power. The Lannisters, for the most part, remained sullen but cautious. Stannis nursed his grudges but bided his time. Renly, ever sociable, helped Gendry charm some of the southern lords. The North, led by Robb Stark in Ned's absence, maintained peace. The Vale was quiet under Lysa Arryn, though her unpredictability was a concern. The Iron Islands tested the crown's resolve with minor raids, but Gendry, on Ned's advice, dispatched ships to patrol the coast. And so, as the tapestry of Westeros continued to weave itself, a new thread had been added. King Gendry Baratheon, the legitimized bastard, stood at the helm. Where once the realm had teetered on the brink of another devastating war, it now navigated a precarious peace. Many lords still watched, waiting to see if this boy king would falter. They wondered if the weight of the crown would crush him as it had crushed so many. But for the moment he strove on, forging his path as he might forge steel, hammering out each new challenge into a shape he could wield. The memory of Robert lingered like a ghost across the Red Keep. Sometimes Gendry would stand on the balcony where his father once stood, gazing over King's Landing with equal parts wonder and dread. In the distance, storms gathered over the horizon. The realm was never truly calm for long, but Gendry had begun to realize a truth. A king could not solve every problem with a single blow of the hammer. A king had to be tempered by wise counsel, by justice, and by humility in the face of what he did not know. His father, for all his strength, had lacked that balance. Gendry vowed that if he ever faltered, he would remember the humility he had learned in the smithy. He would remember that he was once a common boy, forging metal in the heat of the city, longing for nothing more than a fair wage and an honest life. That memory would keep him grounded, keep him from the worst excesses of power. Weeks turned to months, months to years, and though trouble still brewed beyond the horizon, King Gendry carried the lessons of his youth and the guidance of those he trusted close to his heart. He would face rebellions, face the chilling threat from the north, face treachery from within. But he would do so with a hammer in one hand and a crown on his brow, equal measures of might and humility, forging his reign with each new stroke. In the stories told by the small folk, they called him the Blacksmith King, who rose from nameless bastardy to rule the Seven Kingdoms. Whether his reign would be sung in praise or lament was yet to be determined, but the realm had been given an unlooked-for chance at a different kind of future, shaped by a king who understood what it meant to stand among them before he ever knelt upon a throne. In the quiet that followed King Robert's funeral and King Gendry's coronation, the Red Keep seemed both familiar and strange all at once. The wards and retainers continued with their duties, serving meals, cleaning corridors, attending to the newly minted king. Yet a hush lay over every corridor, as if the entire castle drew breath, waiting. The Iron Throne stood at the heart of it all, its twisted swords reflecting candlelight in dull, jagged shapes. Gendry, not yet of age, was its rightful occupant by decree of the late king's will, but he could never look upon that throne without a shiver. He took his seat only under Lord Eddard Stark's watchful eye. For the first few official audiences of his reign, Gendry wore the black and gold tunic that had become a symbol of his sudden elevation, along with a short mantle embroidered with the crowned stag. The crown itself, Robert's heavy circlet, felt too large and too weighty, pressing on his temples like an iron band. Seated upon the Iron Throne, with Ned Stark standing to one side, he listened to the petitions of various lords. Occasionally, he glanced at the crowded hall, searching for some sense of how to appear more confident, more royal. He had hammered many pieces of metal into shape, but forging himself into a king still felt like the greatest challenge of all. Ned spoke in soft tones when counsel was needed, guiding him through each new matter. They heard about local disputes in the Crownlands. Peasants whose fields had been trampled by passing Lannister levies during the tense standoff earlier in the year, knights claiming recompense for damages to their horses, merchants demanding lower port taxes. Gendry learned quickly to distinguish genuine need from opportunistic greed. In the forging of steel, one had to separate slag from iron. In the forging of a kingdom, one had to sift truth from deceit. Ned quietly pointed out the difference whenever possible, but more often Gendry had to rely on his own sense. Sometimes, after those tedious sessions, he left the throne room exhausted, shoulders aching as though he had spent the day swinging a hammer. Yet a curious transformation had begun. The very burdens of the realm, which had once seemed so abstract, were becoming real to him. Each petition had a face, a voice. These were not distant trifles but problems that shaped the lives of lords and small folk alike. As Gendry approved the repair of roads or assigned the crown's resources to rebuild a burned barn, he felt something akin to that moment of bringing hot metal to an anvil. There was a directness, a sense of tangible impact, that at least gave him satisfaction. He was not alone. Lord Renly Baratheon had come to King's Landing, full of easy smiles and courtly wit, offering to help his nephew rule. Gendry had never met Renly before the scandal that erupted over Joffrey and the other Lannister children. They had exchanged few words at the parley with Tywin, as Renly had not been heavily involved in that negotiation. Now they found themselves in the same court, each with a claim to be Baratheon blood. Renly was charming, well-dressed, effortlessly sociable. He made a point of praising Gendry at feasts, referring to him as the rightful king in front of all the courtiers, though a faint tension lay beneath his courtesies, an unspoken question of whether he or Stannis might have been a more natural heir. Still, he never voiced this doubt openly, and Ned counseled Gendry to keep Renly close, for he was popular among certain factions of the Reach and Stormlands. Stannis Baratheon remained on Dragonstone, sending letters to the capital that were neither cordial nor openly hostile. He wrote of the law of lineage of bastardy, yet his tone suggested he would not rise in rebellion as long as Gendry ruled in a manner that served the realm. Ned told Gendry that Stannis was like a razor, sharp, unyielding, and dangerous if handled poorly. But so far that blade remained sheathed. No doubt Stannis was weighing the realm's stability against his own sense of justice. For the moment, he seemed to abide by Robert's final will. Cersei Lannister was another matter entirely. Officially still the queen until a potential annulment or divorce could be arranged, she was a prisoner in all but name. She wandered the Red Keep's corridors like a caged lioness, her hair in disarray more often than not, her eyes hollow with rage. Robert's death had caught her off guard. She had hoped, perhaps, to manipulate events while he still lived. But everything had happened so swiftly. She had lost Joffrey to Casterly Rock, Myrcella to Dorne, Jaime to the Night's Watch, and Tommen's own standing was uncertain. Her father had chosen to recognize Gendry, reluctantly, but with enough firmness to preserve peace. Cersei's glances held nothing but loathing whenever she saw Gendry on the throne. But she had little recourse to strike back, at least not yet. Ned had assigned loyal guards to keep watch on her, and the Master of Whispers, Varys, claimed to have his little birds around her day and night. Despite all the watchfulness, Gendry occasionally sensed that Cersei still plotted. More than once, he thought he glimpsed her speaking quietly to certain servants or lesser knights. At feasts, where she seldom appeared but sometimes made a show of presence, she drank more wine than she ate, her gaze flicking toward him, toward Ned, toward Renly, as if scanning for an opening. Gendry had spent years learning the subtle cracks in an iron bar when it was about to break. He recognized that tension in Cersei's presence, the sense that she might snap or strike when least expected. Ned assured him that her father's stance kept her contained. Still, Gendry could never fully relax in her vicinity. At least he had Arya Stark's companionship. Over the months, Arya remained Gendry's one clear refuge from the layers of courtly artifice. She greeted him with a grin and a teasing remark rather than a bow or a "Your Grace." Even so, Ned occasionally reminded Arya that she should show the proper respect, lest the more conservative lords take offense. Arya rolled her eyes but obliged in public. In private, she and Gendry sparred with wooden swords in the keep's lesser courtyard, out of the watchful eyes of the sycophants. Her quick footwork often outmatched his heavier strikes. He had grown a bit taller since the day he was recognized by Robert, and though still a youth, there was a broadness to his frame that made him formidable with a blade. She joked that he was like a real warrior king in the making, while he teased her for wanting to be a knight. It was a comfort to share those jests, a tiny slice of normalcy in a world where the Iron Throne and the Crown cast shadows over his every movement. Lord Eddard Stark became Regent and Hand of the King, a role he fulfilled with somber diligence. Each day, Ned guided Gendry through matters of state, introducing him to the labyrinthine responsibilities that Robert had often neglected. The Crown's debts to the Iron Bank of Bravos and to House Lannister weighed heavily. Littlefinger, as Master of Coin, offered cunning schemes to rearrange finances, but Gendry found it all dizzying. He preferred Ned's more straightforward approach. Pay what was owed, reduce needless extravagance, raise revenues fairly. Littlefinger smirked at such old-fashioned thinking, yet he gave no open opposition, at least not in front of the king and the hand. Varys meanwhile dispensed whispers of potential threats to Gendry's reign. A sellsword company gathering in the disputed lands, a rumor of dragon skulls in Essos, scattered talk of a Targaryen bride seeking ships. Most of it seemed distant, intangible. The threat of the Lannisters felt more immediate, though Tywin had withdrawn to Casterly Rock. For a time, relative peace settled upon King's Landing. Gendry spent his days in council sessions, hearing the endless needs of the realm. He decreed that certain roads to the Stormlands be repaired before winter, hoping to improve travel for merchants. He met with Tarly envoys from the Reach, forging a new trade agreement for grain shipments. He even welcomed envoys from Dorne, who remained politely aloof about Myrcella's presence in Sunspear but seemed pleased by the chance to influence a new king. Gendry recognized that half of this was courtesy masking deeper ambitions. Still, he tried to treat each envoy with respect, mindful that he was forging alliances that might outlast him. Occasionally, when the strain of it all grew too heavy, Gendry retreated to the castle's smithy. The master smith, a weathered man named Orland, had labored there for years. Though startled at first by the king's presence, he quickly recognized that Gendry sought no pomp, only a chance to roll up his sleeves and feel the heat of the forge. They found a kind of mutual understanding. When Orland had no urgent tasks, he let Gendry help with small pieces, nails, horseshoes, an occasional dagger. Gendry felt more at home in those moments than anywhere else in the castle, save perhaps the training yard with Arya. The clang of metal, the hiss of steam, the familiar smell of coal dust. Those comforts kept him grounded in the memory of who he once was. Meanwhile, Cersei's tensions simmered. Though outwardly caged, she remained the mother of 2 children of great interest. Tommen, still in the Red Keep, and Myrcella in Dorne. The status of these children shaped the realm's alliances, especially with Dorne now invested in Myrcella's betrothal. Tommen was safe, well cared for, and friendly with Gendry, as much as a younger child could be. At times, Gendry felt awkward, unsure how to handle Tommen's boyish desire to play, or show him some new cat he had found lurking in the corridors. Tommen's sweetness made it impossible to harbor any ill will toward him. Indeed, Gendry had grown oddly protective of Tommen, seeing in him someone who had no blame in the Lannister incest or the turmoil that had erupted. Still, Tommen's presence was a reminder of the old regime, and Ned Stark watched carefully to ensure no faction tried to use the boy as a pawn. Dark clouds gathered in the north. Raven after raven arrived bearing reports of White Walkers or Whites, half glimpsed in the forests beyond the wall. Many at court dismissed these rumors as wildling exaggerations. Robert had once done the same, but Ned Stark believed them. He arranged more supply shipments to the Night's Watch and urged Gendry to consider sending more troops, men who would volunteer for the Watch's service. Gendry, mindful of his vow to protect all corners of the realm, agreed, though it sparked controversy among certain lords who preferred their men remain in the south, especially with the Lannisters still powerful. Ned argued that if half the tales from the north were true, the realm would need every sword. So Gendry pushed forward, signing orders to dispatch soldiers from the Crownlands, some from the Stormlands, and a few from the Riverlands. A small trickle, perhaps, but it was more than the Watch had received in decades. Letters from Lord Commander Jeor Mormont expressed gratitude. The uneasy peace at least allowed resources to flow that way. Time slipped by, bringing changes to the Red Keep's daily rhythms. Gendry's name became more familiar across the 7 kingdoms. Some rebellious lords, those who once might have supported Joffrey or dreamt of placing Stannis on the throne, found themselves accepting that Gendry was an earnest king who might rule justly. The small folk of King's Landing, still battered by years of neglect and high taxes, began to notice small improvements. Grain arrived more consistently, water wagons were repaired, and the gold cloaks under the watch of Janos Slynt were restructured by Ned Stark and Renly to reduce corruption. Ser Barristan Selmy, the most veteran Kingsguard, remained in his white cloak, quietly honoring Robert's last commands. He spent much of his time training new recruits to the guard, and Gendry occasionally sparred with him as well. Barristan's calm authority reminded Gendry of Ned's, and though Barristan was not as close a mentor, Gendry valued his opinion on matters of martial honor. Across the narrow sea, whispers grew that Daenerys Targaryen, last surviving child of Aerys II, had aligned herself with powerful warlords in the east. Varys's network relayed rumors of dragons in her possession, tales Gendry found difficult to believe, if not entirely impossible. Some on the council dismissed them outright. Ned Stark, recalling the devastation dragons once wrought upon Westeros, took the rumors more seriously but recommended caution. Stannis, ever firm on matters of bloodlines, sent a raven reminding the crown that the Targaryens had no rightful claim. Gendry found himself in a quandary. Half the realm doubted the existence of living dragons, and the other half didn't know whether the Targaryens mattered anymore. For now, Gendry left it to rumor, mindful that he had enough troubles at home. One day, in the midst of this uneasy calm, Cersei vanished from the Red Keep. She had not been seen at breakfast, nor at midday, nor in her chambers. A flurry of alarm spread among the guards. Lord Eddard Stark immediately organized a search, suspecting that she might have fled or orchestrated some cunning escape. Gendry joined the knights combing the lower levels of the castle, worried about where she might go, what chaos she might unleash. They found her by dusk in Maegor's Holdfast, near a disused section of the castle. She was kneeling on the floor, half-dressed, sobbing. Clutched in her hands was a small locket with a golden lion's head. She glared at the guards when they approached, but she did not resist as they escorted her back to her chambers. That strange incident left the courtiers abuzz with speculation. Some whispered that she had finally broken under the weight of her losses. Others thought it a ruse to gain sympathy. Either way, she returned to her gilded prison, eyes more distant than ever. Months turned to a year. Gendry grew taller, his voice deeper, his presence more assured. Still, he let Ned Stark handle the lion's share of governance while he learned. Renly remained in court, ever eager to host tourneys or lavish feasts, perhaps wanting to influence the new kings shaping alliances. Littlefinger orchestrated the finances with cunning, Varys wove his webs, and Pycelle pretended to be half asleep at every council meeting, though Gendry suspected the Grand Maester's memory was sharper than he let on. A sense of precarious stability took root. In the second year of Gendry's reign, a wedding arrived that promised to tie new bonds between the Crown and the Stormlands. Renly proposed a match for the king, some daughter of a Stormland lord, or even a lady from the Reach. But Ned Stark counseled patience, warning Gendry that he was still quite young, and the realm was not in desperate need of a marriage alliance just yet. Gendry, who had not the slightest notion of wedding any of the ladies who giggled and curtsied before him, was relieved. He confided in Arya that the idea of marriage felt like another chain. Arya snorted, saying she would rather fight with Needle than marry some lord. They laughed at how neither of them fit the roles that society pressed upon them. Yet Gendry was king, and eventually kings must marry. That knowledge sat in the background, a quiet inevitability he chose to ignore for the moment. Far to the west, Tywin Lannister had begun a new campaign of influence, though not through open war. He offered generous terms to certain lords of the Crownlands and Stormlands if they aligned themselves with Casterly Rock in trade. There was talk of gold pouring into the hands of lesser knights, who might one day be called upon to put pressure on Gendry. Ned saw the pattern. Tywin was building a web of financial dependencies that could undermine the crown. Gendry, upon hearing this, recognized that it was a threat no less lethal than an army. He recalled how a blacksmith could break a piece of iron with repeated hits at the same weak spot. Tywin was testing the realm's weak spots. Gendry felt a spark of anger. He ordered that an investigation be launched into any who might be accepting Lannister gold at the expense of their fealty. The matter grew complicated, with Littlefinger half cajoling, half laughing at the notion that the crown could easily unmask such hidden dealings. Still, Gendry tried. If he was to protect the kingdom from slipping into Lannister influence, he could not sit idle. In those days, talk of a great council to solidify Gendry's rule surfaced among some older lords. They recalled that sometimes, to quell doubts about succession, the lords of Westeros gathered and affirmed the new monarch by majority decision. Ned Stark disliked the idea, believing that Robert's will and the current stability sufficed. But others, particularly those from the Vale and certain corners of the Stormlands, felt it might be wise to have the lords formally recognize Gendry and end the murmuring about Stannis or Renly. The matter lingered in the air, unresolved. Gendry himself was uncertain. A great council might unify the realm behind him, or it might give opportunity for his detractors to undermine him. He weighed Ned's counsel heavily, concluding that the time was not quite right, especially with winter looming. Winter indeed was coming. The nights grew longer, the winds colder. Snow dusted the high passes in the Vale, and the north was said to be locked in ice. Letters from the Wall told of more sightings. Walking corpses, dead creatures glimpsed in the swirling snows. A sense of dread began to creep into the realm. Rumors spread in taverns that the long night might be returning. King Gendry, though more certain of himself than before, felt the old helplessness creep in whenever he heard these tales. How could he, a youth with a crown, battle creatures out of legend? Ned assured him that proper preparations were the best the realm could do, short of mobilizing an entire southern army and sending it into the frozen wilderness. The irony was that many southern lords still refused to believe the tales were true. To court, word came of increased wildling raids. A large force, led by a self-styled king beyond the wall, Mance Rayder, threatened to breach the wall in search of safety from the horrors rising in the far north. Gendry held a council meeting with Ned, Renly, and a handful of high lords to discuss a response. Most lords argued that the wildlings were savage raiders and must be crushed. Ned, though stern, reminded them that these were desperate people fleeing something worse. Gendry listened carefully, torn between the common view of wildlings as enemies and Ned's caution that the real threat might lie beyond them. In the end, Gendry resolved to send additional reinforcements to the Night's Watch, but he stopped short of calling for a massed southern host. He also instructed the Watch that if wildlings surrendered peacefully and bent the knee, they might be granted temporary passage. It was a controversial decision. Many lords balked, but Gendry's instincts told him that pushing these wildlings into a corner might only strengthen the greater enemy that lurked in the cold. The measure of a king, he thought, was not always in how hard he struck, but how wisely he balanced necessity and mercy. The friction with the Lannisters, and especially with Cersei, still simmered. At times, Gendry felt the anger of it welling in him. Anger at the knowledge that these golden-haired lions had tried to subvert the throne, that they had brought chaos to his own life. Yet he also felt pity, particularly for Myrcella and Tommen. They were caught in a storm they never asked for. Joffrey, who was older, crueler, and more complicit in the illusions of his upbringing, remained at Casterly Rock, presumably under Tywin's watch. No one in King's Landing had seen him since the day he departed with Tywin's host. A scattering of whispers suggested Joffrey had grown more violent, taking out his frustrations on servants. Kevan Lannister wrote the Red Keep a letter insisting that Joffrey was learning to be a proper lord, but it arrived with no official seal from Tywin, so the contents were suspect. With tension ever present, Ned ordered a discreet increase of the gold cloaks in and around the Red Keep. Though it was not martial law, the sense of watchfulness grew. Citizens entering and leaving the castle were more thoroughly searched, and visitors were questioned about their business. Some lords grumbled, but Gendry recognized the necessity. The peace was tenuous. He would protect the stability he and Ned had built. Perhaps that was a lesson gleaned from his father's single-mindedness. When Robert set his sights on war, he would see it done. Now, Gendry set his mind on preserving order. If anyone threatened that order, he would respond just as decisively. Yet for all the heaviness of rule, Gendry found small joys. One bright morning, he and Arya escaped the watchful eyes of court and rode out of the city incognito, accompanied by only a single guard that Ned had insisted upon. They galloped along the roads near the Rose Road, reveling in the crisp air. Arya whooped as she kicked her horse into a gallop, hair streaming behind her. Gendry, spurring his own steed, followed with a grin, the wind biting at his cheeks. For a moment he felt free, no crown, no throne, just the thrill of speed. Of course, the guard eventually caught up, scolding them for their recklessness. They laughed, promising not to wander too far. That was one of the last times they were allowed such a reprieve without more substantial escort, yet Gendry treasured the memory. In those hours, he recalled the freedom of his old life, the feeling that the whole world was open, unbound by duty. When they finally turned back toward the looming shape of King's Landing, the burden of kingship settled on his shoulders again. As the cold deepened and the year turned, trouble brewed in the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy, ever eager to test the strength of the Iron Throne, began outfitting longships for raids on the western coasts. Reports trickled in that small fishing villages near Lannisport were sacked. Tywin Lannister responded by dispatching his own ships and bannermen to the region. Letters between Tywin and the Iron Throne soon carried a tone of outrage. Tywin demanded that the king declare immediate war on the Iron Islands and crush Balon Greyjoy once and for all. Gendry held council with Ned and the other members. Some suggested that supporting Tywin would mend the breach with the Lannisters and unify them against the Ironborn. Others feared that assisting Tywin so openly would give him undue influence and that the crown might appear a vassal to Lannister interests. Gendry asked Ned for his counsel. Ned pointed out that the Ironborn raids threatened every coastline if unchecked, not just Lannister lands. The realm as a whole would benefit from ensuring Balon did not grow too bold. Still, Ned warned that forging an open alliance with Tywin might invite him to demand more down the line. Ultimately, Gendry chose a middle path. He declared that the realm would defend any Westerosi coasts from raiding, and authorized the royal fleet to patrol not only the western shores but also to keep watch on the sea lanes. He did not directly pledge his swords to Tywin's command. If Balon Greyjoy wanted to test the new king, Gendry was prepared to meet that test on the water, under his own banner. With that decree, several Stormland ships set sail, accompanied by Crownland vessels and a few borrowed from the Reach, thanks to Renly's friendship with Mace Tyrell. They patrolled the waters near Fair Isle and the entrance to the Sunset Sea. For weeks, no major clashes occurred, only small skirmishes with raiders. Each time the Ironborn tested them, they found well-armed ships flying the Stag Banner. Tywin's private war galleys also haunted the region. The tension in the waters mirrored the tension on land. Neither side wanting to yield, neither side wanting to commit to a full-scale engagement. Finally, a standoff settled in. Balon, for the time being, seemed to realize that open conflict would bring the combined might of the Iron Throne and House Lannister down on him. The raids diminished, at least for the moment. Gendry's show of naval force had proven he was not merely a boy in a crown. Through it all, the small folk in King's Landing continued their daily hustle. The markets bustled. Whores plied their trade in the alleys of Flea Bottom. Blacksmiths hammered away. The presence of a new king had not radically changed their lot in life, yet some improvements in the city's infrastructure and decreased corruption among the Gold Cloaks made day-to-day existence a bit less harsh. As word spread that Gendry had once been a blacksmith's apprentice, many in the lower wards viewed him with guarded hope. Courtiers might scoff at the notion that the king was beloved by the common folk, but Gendry himself took small pride in it. He had been among them once, after all. If his reforms helped at least a fraction of them, so much the better. Then, late one autumn evening, a raven arrived from the wall. Its message was brief, urgent, and chilling. The Night's Watch had encountered an army of undead wights, reanimated corpses that moved under the shadow of ancient evil. The letter described a desperate battle at the Fist of the First Men, with many rangers lost, and survivors fleeing back to Castle Black. Lord Commander Mormont wrote that the dead walked, that they slew men and added them to their ranks, and that the true enemy is here. Gendry stood in the council chamber, reading the letter out loud while Ned, Renly, Varys, and others listened in grave silence. Some lords blanched, others looked skeptical. But Ned Stark's face was set, like iron. He had believed the warnings for some time. Now the threat was spelled out plainly for all to see. Immediately, debate erupted. Lord Rosby and others insisted it might be a ruse by the wildlings to sow fear. Varys, in a careful tone, said that while wildling illusions were possible, his little birds heard too many matching whispers to dismiss it all. Renly, equally cautious, pointed out that if the threat was real, the entire realm would have to rally north. But how could they leave the south exposed to opportunists like Balon Greyjoy or Tywin Lannister? Littlefinger chimed in slyly that a king must weigh all threats on the scale of practicality. Gendry, for his part, felt a knot forming in his stomach. This was no normal war. This was something out of the old Nan stories Arya used to mention. Ned Stark proposed an immediate muster of forces from the north, the Riverlands, and the Vale to fortify the wall, urging the Crown to provide men and supplies. He volunteered to return north himself to coordinate with Robb Stark at Winterfell. Gendry glanced around the table, reading the hesitation in the Southern Lord's eyes. Many of them wondered why they should commit resources to an invisible threat at the far end of the world. But Gendry recalled the vow he had made, to protect all corners of the realm. This was more than a border skirmish. If the dead truly marched, the entire realm could be imperiled. He declared that the realm must answer the Watch's plea. He gave Ned permission to ride north with a contingent of Crownland men, perhaps 2,000. He also sent ravens to major lords, entreating them to send reinforcements to the wall. For some, it was a hard sell. Lords demanded financial compensation, protection for their own lands if they stripped themselves of fighting men. Gendry understood their fears. He enlisted Renly to convince the Reach lords to provide supplies. He wrote personally to the Arryns, though Lisa Arryn remained notoriously insular in the Eyrie, claiming the Vale needed all its men for its own defense. The river lords under Edmure Tully were more open to aiding the Watch, as they had always been close to the north. Step by step, Gendry tried to piece together a coalition. Still, he knew that if the dead were as numerous as the letter hinted, 2,000 or 5,000 men might not be enough. They would need unity from across Westeros. Amid this urgent call, Tywin Lannister's support remained in question. Gendry sent a missive politely requesting that the Westerlands contribute men as well. Tywin's reply was cold. He would consider the king's request, but he expected the crown to settle certain outstanding debts to House Lannister first. It was a gambit. Tywin was reminding Gendry that war, whether waged in the north or the south, could not succeed without gold. So Gendry faced a choice: meet Tywin's demands or risk losing the West's support. The council debated fiercely. Littlefinger warned that ignoring Tywin might push him closer to rebellious maneuvers. Renly argued that meeting Tywin's demands would be seen as bowing to the lion. Ned had already left for the north, leaving Gendry without his staunchest counsel on this matter. After nights of deliberation, Gendry compromised. He offered partial repayment of the crown's debt to House Lannister, taking advantage of the improved tax revenues and new trade deals. He also promised that any Lannister forces sent north would be properly provisioned by the crown. In return, Tywin was to commit at least 5,000 men to the defense of the wall if the threat proved real. It was not an ideal arrangement. It meant the realm sank deeper into the financial manipulations that Littlefinger engineered, and it gave Tywin an inflated sense of power. Yet Gendry saw no better option. The dead would not wait for perfect political solutions. The ravens flew, the realm stirred, and slowly, men began to move north. Ned Stark and his host traveled up the King's Road, joined by lords from the Riverlands. In Winterfell, Robb Stark prepared his bannermen, many of whom were uncertain about fighting an enemy that was more rumor than reality. Still, the name Stark carried weight in the north, and the memory of Ned's honor guided them. They marched to the wall, bringing supplies, horses, and sturdy northern bows. Across the narrow sea of farmland, lesser knights and sellswords drifted that way too, drawn by rumors of a potential royal bounty for any man who fought at the wall. The lines of men became a trickle, then a steady stream. Word came that Stannis had dispatched a portion of the Dragonstone garrison. Even some knights of the Vale, ignoring Lady Lysa's timid commands, chose to answer the king's call. It was a ragged coalition, but it was the beginning of something bigger, a realm uniting for a threat that most had never truly believed in. King Gendry remained in King's Landing. He was still a youth, not yet at the age of majority. The hand of the king, Ned Stark, had effectively taken the lead in the north. Renly, seeing an opportunity to assume a more central role, positioned himself closer to Gendry's councils, sometimes clashing with Pycelle or Littlefinger over financial distributions. In the hush of the night, Gendry confided in Arya that he wished he could ride north with Ned, see the threat for himself, prove to the realm that their king would stand in battle. But Ned had insisted he remain. He could not abandon the seat of power, especially when so many intrigues still festered. Arya promised him that if it came to real war, she herself might slip away to join the fight. Gendry half laughed, half believed her. She was as wild as the stories said the North was. As winter deepened, a foreboding sense settled over the capital. The Greyjoys resumed minor raids, Tywin's men dickered over the debt repayments, and rumors spread that Joffrey had been seen training with a savage new swordmaster in the walled yards of Casterly Rock. Meanwhile, Cersei wandered the halls, quieter than ever. The stench of something unspoken clung to the corners of the castle. Gendry found himself having trouble sleeping. Dreams plagued him, dreams of a throne room filled with icy wind, the Iron Throne covered in frost, dead men with glowing blue eyes stalking the corridors. He would jolt awake, heart hammering, unsure whether it was prophecy or mere anxiety. One evening, he ventured into the Godswood of the Red Keep. It was a modest place compared to the grand Godswoods of the north, but it offered some seclusion. He stood by a small pond, watching moonlight glimmer on still water. Footsteps approached. To his surprise, it was Cersei, her hair unkempt, face pale in the moonlight. Gendry tensed, uncertain if she might have come to do him harm. But she only stared at him with a strange, haunted expression. When she spoke, her voice wavered. She spoke of Jaime, of Joffrey, of Tommen and Myrcella. She asked him, almost in a whisper, whether he ever felt ashamed that he had taken everything from her. Gendry felt a knot of conflicting emotions. A surge of defensiveness. He had taken nothing. Robert had chosen him, and a pang of pity. Softly, he told her that he never wanted to take her children's place or destroy her family, but that the incest and the lies had forced Robert's hand. Cersei's mouth twisted in a bitter smile. She said that, in a different world, none of it would have mattered, and her children could have sat the throne unchallenged. She spoke of how love sometimes twists into a blade. Gendry said nothing to that, for he was no expert in love, nor the webs the Lannisters had woven. A hush fell, broken only by the rustling leaves. At length, she turned and left as abruptly as she came. Gendry was left feeling unsettled, as though for a moment he had glimpsed the raw nerve behind her fierce facade. He remembered Ned Stark's stern warnings that she was as cunning as a cornered lioness. Pity or no pity, he could not let her roam free. From then on, he took care not to linger alone where she might corner him again, though part of him wondered if there was more tragedy than malice in her now. Time trudged forward. Letters from Ned brought updates from the Wall. A great assembly of crows. More men arrived from the south daily, though not as many as they truly needed. The wildlings under Mance Rayder also approached, locked in a desperate flight from the White Walkers that harried them. Some watchers on the Wall told stories of shambling corpses, pale and unearthly, attacking in the night. The free folk had fought them, losing entire clans. Gendry stared at these letters, cold creeping into his bones. The realm's petty squabbles felt trivial in comparison. Yet those squabbles threatened to weaken them when unity was needed most. At last, Ned sent word that hostilities at the Wall were imminent. Mance Rayder intended to force a crossing before the dead caught them. The Watch prepared for a siege at Castle Black, while the combined northern host took up defensive positions near the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch as well. The weather was brutal, the ground frozen, supplies short. Ned's letter strongly suggested that if the king wanted to keep the realm safe, now was the time to send the might of the crown northward. Gendry read it under torchlight, a swirl of determination and trepidation filling him. He was still young, not quite a man grown by the reckoning of most lords, but he felt this was his test. How could he remain in King's Landing if a true war was being waged at the Wall? He convened the small council, issuing the decision. He would march north with a southern host. Renly, taken aback, asked if that was wise. If the king left the capital, who would govern? The city was rife with possible uprisings. Cersei might seize the chance to escape or to incite trouble. Tywin might maneuver. Littlefinger offered a silky question about how the realm would pay for another expedition. Varys inquired what would happen if the king died in the far north, leaving no heir. Pycelle coughed theatrically, rambling about the dangers of cold on the royal constitution. Gendry listened, considering each objection. Then he repeated that this was the realm's greatest threat, that a king who did not face it would be no king at all. If the stories were true, Westeros might not have a future unless they united now. He left Renly to serve as regent in his absence, though he was not blind to the risk that giving Renly too much power might feed ambitions. Still, the realm needed a strong figure in the capital, someone with a recognized name. Gendry's choice was also shaped by the fact that he trusted Renly more than he did Littlefinger or Pycelle. As for Cersei, Gendry ordered that she be placed under tighter guard. She would remain within her chambers, with watchers posted at every door. She raged at the indignity, but her protests went unheard. If Gendry was marching north to face an army of the dead, he would not leave her free to conspire behind him. Within a fortnight, the southern host began to gather outside King's Landing. Knights of the Crownlands, some Stormland bannermen, a fraction from the Reach that Renly had convinced to join, and even a handful from the Vale, those who had defied Lysa Arryn's isolationism, arrived. The Tyrell presence was not overwhelming, for Mace Tyrell was hesitant to commit large forces. Nonetheless, A respectable number of men answered the king's call. Gendry donned armor forged in the Red Keep's smithy, black steel inlaid with gold, reminiscent of his father's livery. Arya begged him to let her come, too. Ned Stark was in the north, she argued. Her family was there and she wanted to fight. Gendry hesitated. Arya was only a girl of perhaps 11 or 12. Yet she had the spirit of a warrior. He asked her to stay for her own safety, but she persisted. Renly weighed in, jokingly, that a fierce she-wolf might do more good in the north than all the pomp of knights. In the end, Gendry relented when he saw the steel in Arya's eyes. She would travel with the host but remain under the protection of a guard sworn to keep her from harm, something Arya only half accepted. So the royal host set forth. Gendry left the Red Keep in Renly's hands, with the small council supporting him. The great gates of the city swung open, and the people lined the streets to watch their young king ride out. Some cheered, some gaped at the sight. A boy king with a face not yet scarred by war, wearing black and gold armor, a stag's head on his surcoat. By his side rode Arya Stark, half disguised in simple leather and cloak, needle at her hip. Behind them, rows of knights, men-at-arms, supply wagons, horses, and banners streaming in the chill wind. It was a departure unlike any in recent memory, for rarely had the Iron Throne marched north with such urgency. The specter of the unknown dead loomed over them. The journey was arduous. Cold rains pelted the columns on the King's Road, turning the ground to mud. As they advanced further north, the wind grew fiercer, and occasional flurries of snow dusted the trees. Some men muttered that this was madness, that the stories had to be exaggerated. Others, particularly those from the Stormlands and Crownlands, had never seen a northern winter. They huddled in cloaks at night, cursing the cold. Gendry pressed on, forging a grim determination in his heart. If the realm was to stand, it had to stand now while men still had the strength to fight. Each day, Arya rode near him, sometimes silent, sometimes pointing out passing sights. She spoke of Winterfell, how she hoped to see it again. Gendry reminded her that they were going beyond Winterfell, to the Wall and the war that brewed there. Arya did not flinch. As they drew closer to Moat Cailin, ravens reached them with updates. Ned Stark, Robb Stark, and the combined northern forces, along with the men from the Riverlands, had marched to the Wall. They were fortifying Castle Black, Eastwatch by the Sea, and the Shadow Tower, preparing for an onslaught of both wildlings and the undead that chased them. Some houses, like the Umbers and the Mormonts, had led hundreds of their best warriors. Others, like the Boltons, had joined more reluctantly, raising old suspicions in Ned's mind. But the threat of annihilation by an inhuman foe had a way of forging unity where none had been before. Gendry's southern host reached Winterfell, where they were greeted by servants and fewer lords than expected. Most able-bodied northerners had already marched. In Winterfell's courtyard, Gendry dismounted and gazed around at the ancient keep, the thick walls of gray stone, the huge old godswood. Steam rose from the hot springs that warmed the castle. Arya's face lit up with a strange mixture of relief and longing. She had not set foot in her home for nearly 2 years. They lingered only a short while. Some of Gendry's men took the opportunity to rest and gather supplies, but time pressed them on. The real battle lay further north, where Ned and the Night's Watch awaited. The king's host pressed through the Gift, a land of dwindling farmland, battered by northern winds. At last, the wall itself appeared on the horizon, a colossal barrier of ice, shimmering in the winter sun, stretching endlessly in either direction. Banners whipped in the wind at the base. Tents and fortifications sprawled around Castle Black, turning the foothills into a patchwork of muddy ground and trampled snow. The approach was chaotic. Horses neighed, men cursed, horns blared. Gendry's heart hammered at the sight. This was no mere castle. It was a testament to ancient times, a colossal shield. And beyond it lay the haunted forest, where the dead supposedly roamed. As they neared, Ned Stark emerged to greet them, draped in a heavy fur cloak. His face showed weariness but also relief. Robb Stark stood beside him, taller than Gendry remembered, a serious cast to his features that came from leading men in harsh conditions. Behind them, the banners of House Stark, House Tully, and others flapped in the icy wind. Gendry dismounted, nearly stumbling as his legs ached from the long ride. Ned bowed slightly, addressing him as Your Grace. Though a faint smile touched his lips, it was the smile of a father relieved to see his wards safe. They quickly conferred in a makeshift command tent. The wildling army led by Mance Rayder was encamped beyond the wall, battered by constant attacks from the undead. Mance wanted to lead his people to safety south of the wall. The watch was torn between ancient vows to guard the realm and an urgent recognition that the wildlings were fleeing a worse threat. Meanwhile, scattered battles with undead wights had proven disastrous for small patrols. The Watchers had burned what corpses they could, lest they rise again. Now, Mormont and Ned were discussing a possible agreement with Mance. The wildlings would help defend the wall from the dead in exchange for safe passage to southern lands once the immediate crisis passed. This was uncharted territory. The Watch's vows insisted that no one pass, but the deeper vow was to protect the realm of men from what lay beyond. If the dead slaughtered the wildlings, they would only rise again as more wights. Ned argued that it was madness to let tens of thousands of wildlings in unscreened, but equally mad to watch them die and bolster the ranks of the dead. Gendry, shivering in the drafty tent, listened to the seasoned men debate. He thought of the moment in King's Landing when he had authorized a more lenient policy if wildlings surrendered. Perhaps this was that policy writ large. The alternative seemed to be a war on two fronts, against the dead and against the wildlings. He refused to let that happen. So, with Ned at his side, Gendry ascended the wall the next day. The stairs were treacherous, carved into the sheer ice, whipped by cutting winds. By the time they reached the top, Gendry was gasping, his breath misting in great clouds. He gazed out across the vast whiteness of the haunted forest. Clusters of trees stood stark against snowdrifts. Sunlight glinted off frozen streams. Far to the north, faint columns of smoke marked the wildling camp, and somewhere beyond that lay the dead. The cold stung Gendry's face. For a moment he could not speak, overwhelmed by the scale of it all. From atop the wall, a horn blasted in the distance. Rangers pointed out movement near the wildling camp. Shapes in the snow, perhaps wights, perhaps living men. The vantage offered little clarity. Gendry turned to Ned, eyes wide. They would have to parley with Mance soon, find a solution that might unite them against the dead. Yet how to trust the king beyond the wall? Ned shook his head grimly, saying that trust was scarce in these times, but desperation might serve as a bond stronger than alliances of convenience. Either they worked together or the dead consumed them all. That evening, under the watchful eye of Castle Black sentries, a small group of wildlings approached the wall's main gate, carrying a tattered white flag. They were led by Tormund Giantsbane, a tall, boisterous man with a great red beard. Ned, Gendry, and Lord Commander Mormont came forward, flanked by guards. Tormund greeted them in a rough voice, proclaiming that Mance Rayder was willing to meet the Kneeler King, who had come from the south. He demanded safe passage for a proper parley. Gendry, trying not to let his nerves show, agreed. Within the hour, Mance Rayder himself arrived. A lean, dark-haired man, wearing simple leathers adorned with bones and furs. He had a certain charisma about him, an aura of command that was neither lordly nor savage, but something different. In a hastily erected pavilion at the base of the wall, they convened. The cold bit at every exposed inch of skin. Torches hissed in the wind. Mance spoke plainly. The dead were on the march, picking off wildling camps and swelling their ranks with every corpse. If the wall's defenders refused to open the gate, his people would try to tear it down or find another way through. He had tens of thousands under his banner. Families, clans, fighters, all fleeing the threat. Gendry, seated on a camp stool beside Ned and Mormont, listened. He realized that the wildling situation mirrored his own. They had no good choices, only a desperate gamble for survival. At length, Gendry offered the proposition. If Mance's people laid down arms upon entering and helped defend the wall against the dead, the king would permit them to settle in the lands known as the Gift or, If those proved insufficient, allocate some unclaimed regions further south once the war was done, under the condition that they abide by the king's peace. Mance eyed him with wary disbelief. Tormund snorted, wondering if all Southerners were liars. Ned stood firm, backing the king's offer, explaining that the alternative was destruction for all. After a long silence, Mance nodded. He would bring this offer back to his people, but if the Southerners reneged or tried to enslave them, the wildlings would fight to the last. Gendry, cold and exhausted, promised as solemnly as he could that they would honor the agreement. The next days were a flurry of movement and tension. The gate to the wall opened in intervals, allowing wildlings to pass in small groups so they could be searched for weapons. Many men of the Night's Watch and the northern hosts loomed on the ramparts. Arrows knocked, ready for any betrayal. The wildlings, frightened and bitter, grumbled about kneelers. Yet between them all stood a more terrifying fact. Whites were visible in the far distance, occasionally attacking stragglers or scouting parties. Men returned from the forest pale-faced, speaking of frozen horrors that would not die unless burned. A few of the wildlings bore savage wounds, testament to battles fought in the dark. Fear made them more cooperative than they might otherwise have been. Gendry himself took part in the process, ordering that families with children be sheltered first. The fighters remained outside to form a defensive perimeter with the Watch. It was a harrowing arrangement. Wildlings and Black Brothers side by side against a creeping menace that slunk through the trees by night. Scouts reported eerie howls and glimpses of unnatural blue eyes. Each dawn, men counted the casualties. More and more were rising as whites with each passing skirmish. Eventually, as winter's grip tightened further, the main horde of wildlings had gathered at the base of the wall. Mance Rayder and his lieutenants cooperated with Ned, Mormont, and the other commanders to plan a final stand. They would try to lure the dead into a pitched battle near a choke point in the forest, using fire and steel to destroy them in large numbers. Gendry was uncertain if that was wise. He had never fought an enemy that did not feel fear or pain. Ned explained that they had no choice. The Watchers could not continue letting the undead pick off men in small raids. So the plan was laid. A combined force of wildlings, Night's Watch, and northern/southern soldiers would march a few miles beyond the wall and set up a killing ground, with ditches for fire, barricades, archers in the trees. They would attempt to draw the undead in and burn them en masse. The morning of the battle dawned cold and gray. Gendry felt his heart pounding beneath his new armor. He tried to steady his breathing as he took up position alongside Ned Stark's men. Arya was told to remain behind the lines, safe in the makeshift camp with those too young or untrained to fight. She spat curses at that, but Gendry insisted. The hush of anticipation fell over them all. Crows wheeled overhead. The wind moaned through the bare branches. Then the first whites appeared, stumbling figures with blackened limbs, eyes shining with an unnatural glow. Behind them came more, some dressed in remnants of wildling attire, others in tattered clothing from old watchers or rangers. The stench of decay wafted on the wind. Nerves taut, Gendry raised a hand. A line of archers let loose flaming arrows that arced into the gloom, striking the front ranks of the dead. Some whites stumbled and caught fire, dropping to the snow, but more came on, unaffected by fear or pain. Horns sounded, and the combined forces shouted as they engaged. It was chaos. The ground quickly became a churned mess of blood, ice, and ash. Men hacked at whites only to see them rise again unless struck in the head or doused in flame. Columns of smoke rose from the ditches, which had been set aflame with pitch. Screams filled the air, human and inhuman alike. Gendry fought with a warhammer, reminiscent of his father, though not as massive. His muscles bunched as he swung at a white in torn furs, caving its skull. Beside him, Ned Stark fought with a long sword, moving with a grim efficiency. Torchbearers darted in to set whites ablaze whenever possible. Wildlings bellowed war cries, some on the verge of panic, others savage in their determination not to return to the ranks of the dead. Overhead, crows circled, their calls lost in the din. At one point, Gendry felt the press of bodies threaten to overwhelm him. A white lunged, claws outstretched, its face frozen in a ghastly grin. Gendry slammed his hammer into its ribcage. The creature snapped back, yet still it thrashed. Another wildling set it alight from behind, and it went down screeching. Gendry gasped for air, smoke stinging his eyes. Further along the line, he spotted Mance Rayder in the thick of it, brandishing a curved sword, shouting for his men to hold the line. Snow fell in thick sheets, turning the battlefield into a swirling haze of gray and white. The Watchers' plan, though desperate, began to yield results. The Whites pressed forward, stumbling into the flaming ditches where archers and spear-wielders waited. Fire consumed them in batches, the air filled with the sickening smell of burning flesh. And yet more kept coming. Over hours of brutal fighting, the dead piled up, finally halting their advance as the impetus behind them, the cold masters some called White Walkers, did not appear in force. The Watchers had struck a blow, but not a mortal one. The undead retreated into the swirling snow, fading like phantoms. Sentries with torches kept watch, ready for another onslaught. At last, in the bleak afternoon light, the men realized they had survived the day. Bodies, living and dead, lay strewn across the churned ground. Groans of wounded men rose to the gray sky. Gendry stood among the carnage, chest heaving, hammer slick with gore, eyes burning from smoke. Ned Stark placed a hand on his shoulder. They exchanged a weary nod. The living had won this battle, but the war against the dead was far from over. They had only driven the Whites back, at great cost. Scores of men, wildling and kneeler alike, had perished, and a portion of them would inevitably rise again if not burned. Exhausted men began collecting the bodies for pyres. Grief hung in the air. In the days following, Gendry and Ned conferred with Mance and the Night's Watch. This victory, tenuous though it was, showed that fire and cooperation could stave off the undead threat. The question was how long. The Watchers had to maintain vigilance all along the wall. The wildlings were now partially south, settled in camps near Castle Black. Tensions threatened to rise between them and the Northerners, but the shared horror of battle had tempered some hostilities, at least momentarily. They all understood that worse might come when the heart of winter arrived. The famed White Walkers, tall, icy beings said to wield blades of cold, had not yet shown themselves in strength. This was but a probing attack, or so the Watchers believed. Nevertheless, the battle proved that the realm's unity was crucial. Letters flew south with ravens, detailing the harrowing fight and urging the rest of Westeros to rally. Gendry penned a personal plea to Renly, instructing him to prepare reinforcements and gather fresh supplies. He wrote to Tywin as well, imploring him to send more troops. Whether the proud Lannister lord would comply remained uncertain, but the king had to try. They would need every last man if the next wave came in greater numbers. Winter wore on, each day colder than the last. The men in the camps muttered about the last long night thousands of years ago. They told old stories by the fire, stories of the Night's King and the alliances that once drove the White Walkers back. Gendry, still reeling from the sight of whites on the battlefield, felt the gravity of these legends anew. On some nights, he roamed the camp, checking on the wounded, ensuring supplies were distributed evenly. He passed through wildling areas where suspicious eyes followed him, but no one raised a hand against him. In these gestures, he saw glimmers of a fragile unity. Men who had been foes all their lives now sharing a fire, because the alternative was unimaginable horror. Arya stuck close to the Stark contingent, assisting with chores in the field hospital, ignoring the notion that a highborn lady should remain above such tasks. Gendry found her once, kneeling beside a wounded wildling boy, trying to spoon broth into his mouth. The boy was delirious, but Arya's face was set in determined compassion. She looked up at Gendry as he approached, her eyes reflecting both sadness and the flicker of pride that she could help. Gendry said nothing, just knelt beside her and helped. In that moment, he felt the sense of fellowship that war sometimes forges, a bond that transcended station and old hatreds. Ned Stark, along with Lord Commander Mormont, began organizing regular patrols beyond the wall, aided by wildling guides who knew the terrain. Their goal was to track the movements of any dead wandering the forest. The Watchers established watchfires at strategic points, each fire manned by a mix of Black Brothers and wildlings. The southern troops, under Gendry's banner, assisted in rotation, though many were ill-suited to the harsh conditions. Still, they learned quickly or perished. Gendry participated in a few patrols himself, refusing to remain idle. Ned admonished him to be cautious. A king's life was too valuable to risk, but Gendry felt compelled to see the threat with his own eyes. One frigid night, they came across a small party of whites tearing at a half-eaten carcass of a snow bear. The fight was short and savage, the whites put down with torches and steel. Gendry could hardly breathe in the aftershock, the stench of old death scouring his nostrils. It drove home the reality of what they faced, a starkness that no words could convey. Amid these struggles, ravens from the south brought a mixture of news. Renly reported that Cersei Lannister had attempted escape but was intercepted by gold cloaks at the gates of King's Landing. She had a pouch of suspicious vials that might have been poison or wildfire. She was now held under even tighter guard, her health faltering. Tywin Lannister remained aloof, still sending only a token number of reinforcements north. Balon Greyjoy had escalated his raids, forcing some western lords to draw troops away from the northern cause. The realm was far from united in the face of this existential threat. Gendry seethed at the division, but he could do nothing from the wall except keep calling for more support. That winter saw more skirmishes with the dead. Each time, the combined forces held them off, but each engagement cost lives. The Watchers learned how to fight more effectively, focusing on burning the corpses quickly and using Watchers high in the trees to spot movement. Rumors of White Walkers themselves, glimpsed at the edges of the battles, spread fear. Men claimed they saw tall, gaunt figures with pale flesh like ice, moving silently before vanishing into the snow. None had been confirmed killed or captured. Some said they commanded the whites silently, with gestures of their icy swords. Others said they rode dead horses. The stories varied, but each left men trembling. Yet through blood, sweat, and bitter cold, the Watchers endured. The ephemeral alliance with the wildlings held, if only because both sides understood that the dead threatened them equally. Mance Rayder, near the end of that long winter, once visited Gendry's command tent, remarking that he had never thought he'd see the day a southern king would stand alongside free folk. Gendry, raw-boned from the months of warfare, only replied that he never thought he'd be fighting corpses in a frozen forest. They shared a rueful nod. Perhaps in another life they might have been enemies. Here, they were uneasy allies against a darkness that did not discriminate between kneeler or free folk. As the worst depths of winter approached, the Watchers braced for a final surge. The White Walkers would not remain in the shadows forever, not if they truly sought to conquer the lands of the living. The faintest rumor said they were gathering far to the north, preparing a legion of whites. Gendry, Ned, and Mormont organized every able-bodied fighter into a line of defense. They fortified the approach to the wall with deep trenches, sharpened stakes, and caches of wildfire gleamed from the Night's Watch's old storehouses. The plan was simple. If the White Walkers advanced with their host, the Watchers would lure them into a ring of fire. Fire was the one true weapon they knew worked. Valyrian steel might harm the Walkers themselves, but they had precious little of it. Ned possessed ice, the great sword of House Stark, though it was not Valyrian steel in this telling. In some versions it was. They had only a few other blades of rumored potency. Gendry wielded standard steel, though he had hammered his own sword with the utmost care in the Red Keep. He prayed it would not shatter if faced with the impossible cold. On the eve of this feared assault, a hush fell across the encampments. Snow drifted silently, blanketing tents, extinguishing small fires. Men and women huddled together for warmth, whether they wore black cloaks of the Watch, leathers of the free folk, or the heraldry of southern houses. All eyes turned north, to the deep darkness that cloaked the forest. Scouts had reported eerie lights, shapes moving like shadows in the distance. Gendry walked among the lines, exchanging quiet words with soldiers. He tried to project resolve, though his stomach churned with dread. He found Arya by the mess tents, sharpening needle, a defiant set to her jaw. She stared into the night as though daring any creature to appear. Gendry gently urged her to stick to the rear if battle came, but she scoffed. He did not press the point, for he knew the spirit that drove her. Near midnight, a distant horn blew 3 blasts, the Night's Watch signal for White Walkers. The camp stirred with terror. Torches flared, swords scraped from scabbards. Gendry strapped on his helm, heart hammering. Ned and Robb led the northern lines, Mance and Tormund commanded the wildlings, Mormont and his senior officers coordinated the watch. Gendry took position with a mix of southerners and northern knights. Snow whipped around them, reducing visibility to a swirling haze. Then they heard it. A sound like cracking ice, carried on the wind, and the faint rattle of bones. Shapes emerged, a legion of wights limping forward in ragged formation. Among them, tall figures moved with a fluid grace, eyes pale as moonlight. White Walkers. Chaos erupted. Flaming arrows streaked into the night. War horns bellowed. The Watchers advanced, shouting as they clashed with the front lines of the undead. Fires flared in the trenches, but the White Walkers used their unnatural powers to quell some flames with walls of frost. Gendry found himself locked in a savage melee, hammering down wights that lunged at him with icy claws. He saw a White Walker gliding across the snow on the flank, slicing down men with a blade that emitted a searing cold, swords shattering against it. The Watchers pressed forward, illusions of courage fraying as they realized how lethal these beings were. One Walker raised a hand, and 6 fallen men stirred, rising again as wights. Horror seized the living ranks. Amid the swirl, Ned Stark engaged a Walker, the clang of their blades echoing strangely. Ned's steel sword iced over upon contact, but he pressed on, gritting his teeth. Sparks danced where the metal met the Walker's frosty blade. Mormont, wounded in the leg by a wight, roared for men to keep fighting. The last line of defenders ignited caches of wildfire, and great green explosions lit the night, incinerating hordes of wights. Gendry coughed on the acrid smoke, eyes stinging. He glimpsed Arya weaving through the chaos, stabbing wights in the neck or side, though her small blade did little unless she struck with fire. He shouted for her to pull back, but his voice was lost in the roar. A White Walker closed on Gendry, its silhouette tall and gaunt. Its eyes blazed icy blue in the flicker of wildfire. In its hand was a blade seemingly forged of ice, shimmering with an otherworldly chill. Gendry raised his hammer. They clashed, and an impact of cold nearly numbed his arms. The Walker's strength was immense, but Gendry's own strength, hardened by years at the forge, held him firm. He struck again, sparks flying, ice shards splintering off. The Walker moved unnaturally fast, sidestepping with silent grace. Gendry barely avoided a slash that would have opened his throat. Frost crackled across his gauntlet. He felt his breath seizing in his chest. Summoning every ounce of resolve, he swung the hammer in a brutal arc that caught the Walker's shoulder. The creature hissed, staggering. Gendry's hammerhead glowed faintly from contact with the Walker's blade. One more strike, a savage downward blow aimed at the Walker's chest. His hammer shattered the ice sword, and a strange keening sound filled the air. With a shriek, the Walker dissolved into shards of ice that hit the ground with a tinkling sound, vanishing into vapor. Gendry gasped, steam rising from his body in the chill air. He had done the impossible, slain a White Walker with common steel, or perhaps with the raw force of the forge that had shaped it, hammered over and over with heartfelt determination. Or maybe he had merely been lucky, striking at a moment of weakness. Whatever the reason, the Walker was gone. Yet around him, men still battled for their lives. He saw Ned locked in combat with another Walker, while wildlings and northerners fought side by side against the wights. Once again, pockets of wildfire detonated, flooding the night with green flame, casting dancing shadows of death. The Watchers rallied, seizing the advantage. Mance Rayder led a charge that harried the Walker Ned was fighting, driving it back. Robb Stark's cavalry, though limited, crashed into the whites on the flank, scattering them into the fires. Bit by bit, the tide turned. The Watchers pressed forward, igniting everything in their path. More whites fell, thrashing as the flames consumed them. Another walker retreated, vanishing into the darkness. A shrill wind howled, as if voicing the enemy's frustration. Gradually, the battlefield stilled. Snow fell on heaps of charred corpses. Men coughed and groaned. The Watchers had lost many, but they had held again. A hush fell, broken by the crackle of distant flames. Gendry's arms felt like lead, his entire body numb from cold and exhaustion. He stumbled, leaning on his hammer for support. Nearby, Ned Stark sank to his knees, panting, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. Arya emerged, battered but alive, her face streaked with soot. Mance Rayder limped, supported by Tormund. Their eyes reflected the same stunned realization. They had won another battle. But the White Walkers had not been fully destroyed. They had tested the Watchers' defenses again. Perhaps next time they would bring even greater forces. In the aftermath, Gendry oversaw the pyres of the dead, ensuring that no corpse would rise. He stood watch as men tossed the bodies of fallen comrades onto the flames, tears in their eyes. Some wildlings wailed for lost kin, while black brothers saluted their fallen with the old prayers of the Watch. Northern lords and southern knights regarded each other with a new respect. Each had shed blood in the same frozen mire. Each had faced an enemy beyond mortal comprehension. Gendry could hardly process the enormity of it. All he could think was that they had to keep fighting, keep uniting the realm, or this wave of death would roll over them sooner or later. Word spread of Gendry's encounter with the White Walker, how he had shattered its blade and destroyed it. Some chalked it up to luck. Others whispered that perhaps his hammer had taken on properties from the dragonfire of the forging process, or that the old gods or the Seven had blessed it. Gendry dismissed such talk, but men clung to hope wherever they could find it. If a king could kill a walker, then maybe the realm was not doomed. That was the sentiment that spread among the battered ranks. In the following weeks, Gendry, Ned, Mormont, and Mance redoubled efforts to fortify the wall and train the men in the tactics that had proven effective. Thick walls of fire, massed archery, concentrated use of wildfire. They scouted far to the north whenever possible, gleaning hints of the enemy's movements. Yet the White Walkers had melted away into the vastness of the frozen wilderness. Some men believed they would come again when the night was darkest, perhaps in the dead of the next winter. Others thought these two significant defeats might cause them to retreat for a time. No one truly knew. Regardless, the Watchers braced themselves for the worst. A hush of uneasy peace settled over Castle Black. More wildlings trickled south, joining the makeshift camps, some bearing horrific stories of entire tribes wiped out. The Watchers huddled in furs, patrolling day and night. Gendry found no glory in this so-called victory, only the knowledge that they had survived. Occasionally, ravens arrived from the south, bringing accounts of political strife. Tywin Lannister, unimpressed by intangible threats, threatened to withdraw his own men unless the crown made further payments. Balon Greyjoy pillaged the coastline. Even in the face of apocalyptic danger, the old feuds continued. Gendry felt a surge of weariness that reached down to his bones. But overshadowing all the petty politics was the sense that if the Watchers here failed, none of that would matter. The dead would sweep down like a great wave and drown the Seven Kingdoms in ice and blood. As the nights grew longer, Gendry stood upon the wall, gaze drifting northward, remembering the swirling chaos of the battle, the hiss of the walker he had killed. He wondered if the realm would ever be truly free of that menace. If unity could hold when faced with an enemy that never tired, never negotiated. For now, at least, they stood on the brink and did not fall. Ned Stark approached him one evening, placing a warm fur cloak around Gendry's shoulders. Together, they looked over the frozen expanse. Ned spoke softly, acknowledging that Gendry had proven himself no longer just a boy with a crown. He had led men into battle, he had faced nightmares and prevailed. Ned said there was no prouder testament to Robert's decision. Gendry, suddenly feeling the weight of every death he had witnessed, replied that he still felt like a blacksmith playing at being king. Ned gave him a wan smile, admitting that every king, every leader, feels that way at times. In the end, it was the willingness to shoulder the burden, to keep hammering away despite the odds, that separated a good king from a tyrant or a fool. High above them, the night sky shimmered with faint northern lights, curtains of green and purple dancing among the stars. The air was painfully cold, but Gendry found some spark of warmth in Ned's words. He thought of the small folk in King's Landing, the blacksmith shops, the guards, the children, the entire realm that depended on them. He thought of Arya's laughter, the battered men who had followed him into the snow, the wildlings who had placed their trust, however grudgingly, in a king they once called a kneeler. He vowed silently that he would not falter. The forging of a stable Westeros was far from finished, but at least in these moments, at the edge of the world, Gendry had hammered out a shape of hope, fragile, partial, but gleaming nonetheless. In the nights and days to come, that hope would be tested again and again, by the dead in the north, by the schemers in the south, by the fractious lords and by the realm's ingrained divisions. Yet the story of the bastard king, the blacksmith king, had only just begun. If he could wield his hammer and his crown with equal skill, perhaps he would forge an age in which even the darkest winter could not snuff out the flame of mankind's will to live free. And so, upon the wall or in the throne room of King's Landing, Gendry would stand, forging one blow at a time, determined that the realm would endure, because for all the cruelty and chaos in the world, for all the old lies and bitter truths, men must try. And he, a once nameless boy, had decided to try with all the strength in his arm and all the heart in his chest.